Ever wondered what happens when you'll get all you favorite adult fictions at one place? Yay, you heard it right! Welcome to my Patreon. Currently, we have more than 200+ stories collections. Exclusive, uncensored, 18+ fan fiction awaits you. Stories too bold for the mainstream, crafted for true fans. Dive into steamy world of Harry Potter, Naruto, and Deku. Untamed passion and raw power. Only on Patreon. Ready to unlock the secrets? Join now, link in the description.
Now, today, we are gonna see, what if Harry Potter was overpowered Dragonic wizard? This video is not one story but may have many different stories. Join Patreon for early ACESS of Super Op stories. Also adult and steamy Harry Potter stories too. Please subscribe this channel, because definitely I will try my best to provide a valuable content for you all. LSO check the description to support the original author for this beautiful creation. Summary. After a great war between the wizarding world and the muggle world, the earth has been lost. Harry dies a broken man. Only to encounter Gaia, the spirit of the earth. She gives the last wizard of earth a very important mission. She will send him to Pandora, and he will, in turn, become its protector. Against the humans who destroyed their own world and now seek to do the same to another. Will Harry be up to the task? Harry sighed as he watched the gate close. It's done. Then, Harry thought sadly, they're all gone. I am alone. Slowly turning, Harry took in the empty ruin that used to be the Department of Mysteries. Usually, it was bustling with activity as unspeakables went about their business. But now it was completely empty of all life, save one broken-hearted old man. The rest of the Ministry of Magic was the same, entirely empty, as Harry slowly made his way through each individual department. He looked sadly at the desks and offices where once his friends had worked, where once he had worked, now forever silent. Once the gateway had closed, the process had begun, and Harry could feel the tremors spreading throughout the ministry. A unique spell created by the unspeakables would soon cause the ministry and everything in it to simply crumble to dust. Diagon all. And every other place of magic were set to follow, and in 24 hours, all trace that wizards and witches had once lived on Earth would be gone. Being that most of the seats of magical government, spread across the globe resided under the ground, there would undoubtedly be massive destruction across the earth as buildings that had once sat beneath the foundations of the Muggle world simply ceased to be. But Harry didn't care at all about the untold deaths that would soon come. It was nothing less than the Muggles deserved. As Harry came to the office that had once been his, he sighed sadly again before going in and taking one last look around. Like every other part of the ministry, his office was in disarray as the previous few months hadn't left much time for housekeeping. As Harry slowly sat himself down, he felt the weight of his years finally begin to creep up on him. Pouring himself a glass of fire whiskey, Harry slowly leaned across his desk and picked up a picture frame that showed his wife and their 3 children. I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you, Harry thought as a tear ran down his cheek. All I can do is beg your forgiveness when I see you again. Another tremor shook the ministry. This time far more violently, and Harry gently placed the frame on the desk before taking another drink as the memories of what had happened swam across his mind. After Voldemort's fall, there had been peace. For 20 long years, Harry and those who had fought at the Battle of Hogwarts had done everything in their power to ensure that someone like Voldemort would never rise again. Bit by bit, Harry and his friends had loosened the stranglehold that the purebloods of the wizarding world had had on society for centuries, creating a better world than the one that Harry and his friends had grown up in. There had been plenty of roadblocks along the way, caused by those who didn't like how quickly their world was changing, nor the fact that they were effectively losing the power that they had used like a weapon for generations. But Harry had finally decided to use his fame, something that he had once hated above all things, to do some good, and became very acted at using his power and fame like a weapon to force through new laws regarding fair treatment of Muggle-borns, creatures that the ministry considered dark, as well as a myriad of other new laws and changes. With the combined intelligence of Hermione, and the refusal to bow down to a Dark Lord ever again from the rest of the wizarding world, Harry effectively brought the wizarding world key. Sea King and screaming into the 20th century. Then came the thing that Harry and everyone else had feared. angry and afraid that their world was changing too fast. The purebloods had rallied around a Dark Wizard who promised to halt the changes that had rocked the wizarding world, Lord Baphomet. Whereas Voldemort was subtle and attacked with secrecy, Baphomet attacked like a tsunami, killing and destroying everything in his path. In his first appearance, Baphomet had unleashed fiendfire on the city of London, causing the city to burn out of control for nearly a week before the Ministry finally managed to get it under control. But the end result was over 3,000 dead Muggles, and almost 500 dead magic folks. The war only got worse from there, and Harry was forced to watch as so many of his friends fell to Baphomet and his followers: Parvati Patil, Seamus Finnegan, Percy Weasley, Neville Longbottom, Cho Chang, Kingsley Shacklebolt. Each death was like a knife to Harry's heart. They had earned the right to live in peace and were trying to make the world a better place for their children, and yet were forced to fight in a war once again that no one wanted in the first place. It had taken almost 6 years of blood and death before Baphomet and his followers were finally defeated, but then a new problem appeared, one that not even Harry could stand up to, no matter how much he might wish to. Due to Baphomet's war, the Muggle world had discovered the existence of magic. The statue of secrecy was gone for good, for there was no way to hide how much devastation and destruction had been caused at Baphomet's hands. Just as predicted, the Muggles turned on the wizarding world, some for religious reasons, some for revenge for those who had been lost to Baphomet, and theirs because magic was a threat to their power and, therefore, must be destroyed. World War III had begun just days after the death of Lord Baphomet, and it was effectively the Muggles on one side, and the wizarding world on the other. The giants were hunted to extinction, as were the werewolves. Though the Muggles lost hundreds of thousands before the last wolf fell, the lucky wizards and witches were the ones who died in battle. Rather than be caught, men, women, children, it didn't matter to the Muggles. If the person had the ability to use magic, they were guilty and summarily executed as a result. Burning was the most preferred way to kill those that the Muggles saw as evil, and there were so many fires in the past few years, including Luna Lovegood, Ginny Weasley, and Harry's 2 children, Rose and Albus. Harry had been apoplectic at the loss of his family, and in a fit of pure rage and hatred, he had unleashed a massive wave of fiendfire on those he felt were responsible. Still, he had not counted on how powerful his spell would be, and as a result, over 500,000 had died as the fire spread out of control. Afterward, Harry had become much colder and much more ruthless towards those he viewed as the murderers of his family and people. To the Muggles, Harry had become the devil himself, and they had come to call Harry the Emerald Dragon, due to Harry's green eyes and his propensity to unleash fiendfire on them with no mercy. After 5 years of war and no end in sight, the various governments came together to create a plan to save their people from this never-ending path of destruction and death. The Unspeakables had been the ones to devise a plan to save the wizarding world and stop the war once and for all. After several centuries of experimentation and discovery, the Unspeakables had discovered an entirely new realm devoid of life, but where magic flowed in abundance. In effect, a world where no Muggle could find them and where they would be able to live safely and start over. The various governments had needed almost no time to consider this plan and had ordered the Unspeakables to begin the ritual that would open the gateway to this new realm. It had taken nearly 5 years, but at last, the gateway was created, and the wizarding world began to ready themselves to leave. Hundreds of magical creatures were captured and locked away in cages for transport. Magical fauna was likewise harvested. The goblins of Gringotts emptied their bank of every single thing of value, leaving the bank empty for the first time in its history. The wizarding world, in effect, took everything it had as they were not planning on coming back to, or seeing, Earth ever again. Then, as the day came to leave, the Unspeakables found a problem that could not be fixed. Someone had to stay behind to keep the gateway open while the rest of the wizarding world escaped to their new world. Someone had to continually recite the words that would keep the gateway open. For should the words stop being repeated, the gateway would close, and the ritual would have to be restarted, and who knew how long that would take, years maybe. Harry had immediately stepped forward and volunteered. Hermione and Ron had tried to dissuade him, all his friends had, but they all found him quite adamant that it would be him and no one else. Harry had nothing left. His family was gone, his spirit was crushed from years of constant war. He was done. This new world would be a place for the wizarding world to start over, correct their past mistakes and build a bright and better future. It was not somewhere that needed a broken and angry warrior like Harry Potter. The ICW, who would effectively become the new government in the new world they were going to, had promised Harry that his sacrifice would never be forgotten and that they would build a statue of him for future generations to see and remember that Harry had saved them all. Harry had almost laughed at that, as he imagined what a giant statue of him would look like. Then came the day to leave Earth behind. For days on end, Harry kept speaking. Hermione and Ron helped by giving him water to keep his voice from breaking and pepper up potions to keep him from falling asleep due to exhaustion as the long line of wizards and witches stepped into the gate with their various belongings, only to disappear a moment later. Finally, there were only 3 people left: Harry, Ron, and Hermione. "How can you just expect me to walk away and leave my best mate behind?" Ron had asked in a broken voice as tears ran down his face. "We're supposed to grow old together, mate. Old and fat and tell our grandkids lies about when we were kids ourselves." Harry had laughed at that as his own tears ran down his cheeks. Before grabbing Ron and hugging his oldest friend for all he was worth. "I'll give Ginny your love, Ron," Harry whispered, making Ron choke back a sob as he hugged Harry back. "And one day, when we see each other again, you'll have to tell me what this new world was like." As Ron pulled away, Hermione took his place and wrapped her arms around Harry as tight as she could. "You're the best friend I've ever had," Hermione had sobbed. "I don't know how I'm going to survive without you by my side. The 3 of us have never been apart. We'll see each other again, my own," Harry said with a happy sob. "One day. We will see each other again one day, and the 3 of us will never be separated again." Hermione issued what sounded like a combination of a sob and a laugh as she pulled away from her first friend, futilely wiping her eyes as more tears took their place. "You two best be going," Harry said, nodding his head at the gateway, which had begun to fluctuate due to Harry not reciting anymore. "They're waiting for you." Ron took Hermione's hand and gently began to pull her toward the gateway as she sobbed even harder at the knowledge that she would never see her friend again. Before they stepped into the gateway, both turned back one last time and gave Harry a final smile, which Harry returned. Then they were gone. The office shook violently again as Harry drained the last of his glass, enjoying the way it burned down his throat. Cracks had begun to form on the ceiling of his office, and he knew that if he didn't leave soon, he would be buried when the ministry came crashing down. "I'm going to die at work," Harry thought with a grin as he refilled his glass. As he took a sip, Harry snorted in amusement at the fact that he was the last wizard on Earth and that in a few minutes, he would die at his desk. The snort soon turned into full-blown laughter that had Harry coughing a few minutes later as he tried to regain control of himself. With a final sigh of weariness, Harry raised his glass in a mock toast to his friends, those who had passed into the new world where they would be forever safe from the Muggles. "Here's to you, guys," Harry said happily. "May your new world be better than ours was." As Harry drained the last of his glass, the room shook again, and the ceiling collapsed on top of him, and Harry James Potter, the hero of the wizarding world, the boy who lived, died. "Where am I?" Harry asked as he opened his eyes. Oh no, not again. Harry was standing in King's Cross Station just as he had been so many years ago when he had let Voldemort kill him in order to save his friends. The station was empty, just like last time, and Harry half expected to see Headmaster Dumbledore somewhere waiting for him with his damnable twinkling eyes. "Hello, Harry," a soft voice said, making Harry spin around and almost lose his balance. When he regained his footing and could see who had spoken, Harry felt his jaw drop in awe as he beheld the woman who had spoken. In all the years of Harry's life, he had never seen anyone so beautiful. It was as though someone had molded the woman from the most appealing and beautiful aspects into one entity. The woman's hair was silver and hung to her waist in flowing ripples as though it were made of water. Her eyes were dark blue and reminded Harry of the waters of the Caribbean. As she took a step closer, Harry tore his eyes away from her face to see that she appeared to be wearing a dress made of green leaves, while her feet were barefoot. Looking down at himself, Harry saw that he was naked and issued an eep. Before quickly trying to cover his private parts, the woman gave a small laugh at this, and her hand went to cover her mouth as a small smile spread across her face that made Harry turn red with embarrassment. Could I have some clothes, please? Harry asked in a small voice that seemed to amuse the woman even more. You may, if you wish it, the woman replied in a voice that washed over Harry like a warm spring and left him feeling instantly relaxed. What do you mean? Harry asked. This is the world between worlds, the woman replied as she waved her hand around them. If you wish for clothes, then you will have them. Slowly, Harry closed his eyes and wished for something that would cover his shame. An instant later, as he opened his eyes, he saw, to his shock, that he was wearing a long silvery robe that reminded him of the types of robes that Dumbledore used to wear. Thank you, Ms. I am Gaia, the woman replied with a smile, Mother of Earth. Instantly, Harry felt his jaw drop, and it took all his willpower not to fall to his knees. He was standing before a literal goddess, and for a moment, he didn't know whether to bow or run for his life. Gaia seemed to read his thoughts as a smile grew across his face, and she once again hid her laugh behind her hand. There's no need for supplication, Harry, Gaia said warmly. I think you're past the need for that, don't you? Harry nodded before taking in his surroundings again. So, I guess I died again? Harry asked with a smile. Does this mean I get to take a train, as Dumbledore called it? If you wish it, Gaia said simply, making Harry turn to her in confusion. What do you mean? Come, let's sit and talk a moment, Gaia said as she moved regally toward a nearby seat before sitting down softly with all the bearing of a queen. With no small amount of trepidation, Harry joined her, careful to keep a sensible distance between the two of them. That was an incredibly brave thing you did, Harry, Gaia said softly. You've given your people a new chance. Entire generations will grow up listening to stories of the hero who saved them all, Harry Potter. Harry blushed under her words and, for a moment, was rendered speechless as he tried to swallow his sorrow at being left behind. I'm glad that they are safe. They are, Harry, Gaia said with a smile, safe and happy, Hermione. And Ron's daughter will name her first child after you. And he will live up to your name and lead his people into a golden age of peace and prosperity. Harry nodded at that, not trusting himself to not begin weeping as he thought of his friends, happy that they were finally beyond the reach of those who had been hunting them for so long. But there are also consequences to what you did, Harry, Gaia said sadly, making Harry turn to her with alarm. What do you mean? Harry asked as he shook slightly, fearing that he may have angered the goddess of the earth. When magic disappeared from Earth, all the buildings that lay beneath it collapsed, causing unimaginable destruction on a global scale. Millions died in the ensuing chaos, and millions more will die in the years to come from starvation, exposure, and war for the few remaining resources. Am I supposed to care about that? Harry asked coldly. Those people slaughtered hundreds of thousands of my people. Let them suffer. You don't mean that, Harry, Gaia said softly, placing a comforting hand on his. You are a good person, no matter how hard you try to hide it. Harry said nothing and simply looked down in silence as Gaia continued in the same soft voice as before. It will take many years, but humanity will recover and become even stronger. And that strength will lead to my death. Harry's head whipped up at that, and he looked at Gaia with horror as he struggled to find words. You're going to die. Goddesses can't die. I assure you that we can, Harry, Gaia said sadly. Without a common enemy, humanity will once again break apart into feuding and infighting as they suck the earth dry of everything it has to offer. Nothing will be left in 100 years, and the earth will begin to die. I will begin to die. Then why not do something about it? Harry replied angrily. Cause a flood or something. Go Old Testament on their asses. While Harry watched in confusion, Gaia laughed at that as though it were the funniest thing she had ever heard. Unfortunately, I no longer have that kind of power, young wizard, Gaia said with a sigh. When your people fled the earth, you took a great deal of my power with you. Now all I can do is watch as humanity kills itself and me along with it. Harry felt the blood run from his face at the words, and a sudden wetness on his cheeks told him that he had started crying. A moment later, Harry was kneeling in front of Gaia with a heartbroken look on his face as he stared up at her. We are responsible for killing you. Please forgive me. I didn't know. Peace, child, Gaia said softly as she placed a hand on his cheek. I don't blame you. How could I blame someone so good for something like that? But you're going to die. And it's our fault. Everything dies, child, Gaia said simply. Nothing is eternal, not even the ground beneath our feet. But there must be some way to stop it. Can't I do something to help? Harry asked desperately. Gaia looked down at Harry with a warm smile like a mother gazing fondly at her child, and Harry felt her love flow into him. It was so beautiful and so pure that it left Harry speechless. There is something you can do, Harry, Gaia said softly. But it must be your choice. What would you have me do? Harry asked in a whisper. Many years from now, when I am gone, when the earth is no more, humanity will spread out among the stars looking for another world to pilfer and destroy. They will find a lush and fertile world called Pandora, inhabited by an interminable amount of life, but all they will see is another world to conquer and suck dry. If you choose to, I will send you to this world, and you will be its protector to ensure that it doesn't suffer the same fate that yours will. But if you make this choice, it will be a very long time before you see your friends and family again. Harry's thoughts raced as he considered Gaia's words. On the one hand, he was almost directly responsible for the destruction that humanity would inflict on her. On the other hand, hadn't he fought enough? Hadn't he given enough? Hadn't he earned his rest after all he'd done? With a sad sigh, Harry knew which choice he would make. Being a hero was as much a part of him as his own skin, and he couldn't let the Muggles do to Pandora what they had done to Earth. As Harry looked up into Gaia's face, he saw her beaming at him as though she already knew his choice. Then, as Harry smiled back, she gently rose to her feet and raised him up with her. I will use the last of my power to de-age you so that when you arrive on Pandora, you will be able to have the childhood that you were denied on Earth. But won't that be dangerous? Harry asked. I can't fight against the Muggles as a kid. You will have a good long while to grow and learn before they arrive, Gaia said with a laugh, and when they do come, you will be ready for them. All right then, Harry replied with a shrug as a strange blue train suddenly appeared in front of them. When you awaken on Pandora, you will encounter the beings that live there, Gaia said with a smile. They are called the Navi. They will teach you how to live on Pandora, and in turn, you will teach them how to defend their world from those who will pillage it. Harry nodded as he walked to the train. As he stepped inside, he turned to look at Gaia one last time with a sad expression. I won't fail you, Gaia, I promise, Harry said sadly as a tear ran down his face. I know you won't, Harry, Gaia replied, smiling. I hope you enjoy your second childhood and defend your home when the time comes. Quote. Before Harry could reply, the doors to the train slid shut, and the train pulled away. The last thing Harry saw before the bright light blinded him was Gaia waving goodbye with a sad yet happy expression on her face. Well, this feels nice, Harry thought as he slowly began to awaken. As he opened his eyes, he saw that he was lying in what appeared to be a great forest. Above him, trees rose to the sky and blocked out the sun's rays. With a long yawn, Harry rose to a sitting position and took in his surroundings. He was definitely in a forest, and it was oppressively humid. Man, it feels like I'm back in the Amazon, Harry thought with a wry chuckle as he remembered the battle that had taken place there. As Harry scratched his chest, he realized he wasn't wearing any clothes, save for a brown loincloth that hid the most private parts of his anatomy. Slowly, Harry rose shakily to his feet and looked at his body in shock and awe in equal measure. He appeared to be a very young child. And even more amazing was that he had blue skin, and what's more, he had a tail. On shaky feet, Harry slowly strode over to a nearby pond and knelt in front of it as he looked at his reflection in nothing short of shock. He looked to be about 6 years old, and even stranger was that he looked like a blue cat, and for a moment he wondered if he had accidentally shifted into an animagus. As Harry examined his reflection some more, he noticed other things about himself. He had what appeared to be a long black braid hanging down his back, 4 fingers instead of 5, and what appeared to be tiny white dots all over his skin. With a grimace, Harry took some pond water and tried to rub the dots off, only to discover that they were, in fact, part of his skin. Finally giving up, Harry rose back to his feet and looked around in sudden trepidation. Gaia said that he would need to meet up with the inhabitants of this world, the Na'vi, and that they would teach him how to survive on Pandora. But he had no idea where to find them nor where to even begin looking. He had no idea what was edible and what wasn't, no idea where he even was, and no idea what kind of creatures inhabited this world that would most likely like nothing better than to turn him into a meal. Given the fact that he was so small, Harry doubted that he would last very long without help. The child in Harry chose that moment to have a panic attack, and Harry felt tears run down his face as he realized how much danger he was truly in. Slowly, Harry made his way to a nearby tree before sliding down it. Bringing his legs up, wrapping his arms around his knees and beginning to cry. Finally, after a few moments of this, the adult in Harry regained control, and Harry angrily wiped his face before rising back to his feet. Shelter first, Harry thought determinedly, then food. One thing at a time. For the next few hours, Harry wandered aimlessly through the forest, gazing in awe at all that was around him. The forest was beyond beautiful, and every now and then, Harry would encounter a different creature that would scurry off before he could get a closer look at it. The sun was beginning to set when Harry heard a strange noise that seemed to be getting closer. As he listened, Harry realized that it sounded like hooves, and immediately he began to think of horses. Horses meant people, and people possibly meant the Na'vi and safety. Still, years of war had taught Harry that it was always better to be cautious than be caught unawares, so with all the speed that his little body could muster, Harry dove over a fallen log and waited for the horses to draw closer. A few moments later, 6 horses appeared out of the brush, but they were the strangest horses he had ever seen. For one thing, they were silver and blue. For another, they were the size of an elephant with long necks and small heads. But the strangest thing was what was sitting on its back. A giant blue cat-like creature looked like Harry, only much bigger and stronger. As Harry watched, the cat person jumped from the horse's back and seemed to detach its black braid from one of the horse's tentacles, making Harry frown in bewilderment. Could his braid do that? Why have we stopped? One of the Na'vi asked as he prodded his mount forward. I have found tracks, the Na'vi who had jumped from his mount responded. But they are very strange. How do you mean? Another Na'vi asked. They look like a child's, the riderless Na'vi replied as he knelt and examined Harry's footprint, making Harry gulp from where he was peeking. Why would a child be this far out? A Na'vi asked. Perhaps it's from one of the other clans. The riderless Na'vi replied. A moment later, he rose to his feet and began to follow Harry's footprints. As he got closer, Harry began to panic. What would they do if they found him? When the Na'vi was almost upon him, Harry jumped to his feet, causing the Na'vi to jump back in surprise at Harry's sudden appearance. Before the Na'vi could say anything, Harry turned and ran as fast as his little legs could carry him as sudden shouts rang out from behind him. Harry dove under logs and jumped over fallen trees as he desperately tried to escape his pursuers, who were rapidly gaining ground on him if the thunder of hooves was any indication. A sudden explosion of shish made Harry stop in his tracks just in time to see a mounted Na'vi appear in front of him. Turning to run back the way he had come, Harry saw that the other mounted Na'vi had finally caught up and Harry was now trapped. The child in Harry took over again, and slowly, Harry backed up until his back was pressed against the bark of a tree as the Na'vi dismounted and warily approached him. I'm in trouble, Harry thought as fear rolled through him. We mean you no harm, little one of the Na'vi said softly as he approached slowly. My name is Raziel. What are you doing out here? Where are your parents? For a few moments, Harry said nothing, simply stared in fear at the giants who were gazing down at him with suspicion. Swallowing his fear at last, Harry replied in a small voice. They're dead. Surprise showed on the Na'vi faces for a moment before Raziel spoke again. Why are you out here all alone? Where is your clan? They cast me out, Harry lied, knowing that a bit of sympathy might keep them from killing him. Said they didn't need another useless mouth to feed. Anger spread across the faces of the Na'vi riders at that, and for a moment, Harry thought he might have messed up with his lie. But then Raziel spoke again in a very gentle voice. You're out here all alone. Slowly, Harry nodded his head as he sniffled miserably. The adult in him knew that if it came down to it, he wasn't strong or big enough to properly fight the Na'vi, and the child in him was terrified that they were going to hurt him. Well then, I must insist you come with us, Raziel said warmly, extending a hand to Harry, who looked at it with surprise. I don't want to be in any trouble. You don't have to worry about me, Harry said softly as he stared at his feet. It's no trouble, child, Raziel said with a gentle smile. And I cannot leave you out here all alone. My maid would kill me if she heard that I did that. Laughter spread amongst the mounted navvy as Harry chewed his lip nervously and tried to decide what to do. Gaia had told him to seek out the navvy and learn from them, but he knew nothing about these people. They could be planning to eat him for all he knew. With a final nervous shift, Harry slowly extended his arm and took Raziel's hand as the navvy watched with warm smiles. What's your name, little one? Raziel asked as he gently pulled Harry toward his mount. Harry, sir, Harry replied shyly. Come then, Harry, Raziel said warmly as he picked Harry up and placed him on the large horse. We'll go back to the home tree and figure out what to do with you. Everything will be okay, I promise. Harry nodded his head, causing Raziel to smile at him before he jumped onto the horse behind Harry and attached his braid to the horse's tentacle. A moment later, Raziel kicked in his heels. And Harry found himself desperately hanging on as the navvy tore through the brush. The son of the Titan. The son of the Titan. Magic is an incredible thing. Its limits are as endless as the sky. And those that practice it are capable of great evil or great good, depending on how they use it. A decade ago, magic's potential was pushed further than it ever had been bef. Or when a hole appeared in the Department of Mysteries that led to an entirely new world called Fury where magic wasn't hidden like it is in this world, but rather a part of everyday life that everyone was entitled to. At first, these two worlds were wary of each other since, in one world, magic was celebrated, while in the other, it was hidden. Still, in time an understanding came between the two, and soon the hole was transformed into a gate that allowed travel between the two worlds and the trade of knowledge and information that soon benefited both worlds. Economics and academics soon flourished as each world shared its knowledge with the other. Even politics, which had been stagnated for decades in the Wizarding world, began to make changes as the Wizarding world was granted seats on Fiore's Wizard Council. And members of the Wizengamot were granted similar rights, thereby allowing both worlds a voice in the affairs of the other. Natsu yawned loudly as he walked down the street. Beside him walked Lucy, Gray, and Urza. The four of them had crossed the border 2 weeks ago for a much-needed vacation by order of their guild master, Makarov. For the first few days, the group explored the city of London, careful to not use their magic as dictated to them by the Ministry of Magic upon their arrival through the gate connecting the two worlds. The citizens of Fury Universe. Sally agreed that the so-called Statute of Secrecy was complete nonsense, but they agreed to follow the rules of the Wizarding world. That was why Natsu was forced to leave Happy behind in Fury, much to the Blue Cat's annoyance. After exploring as much as they could of magical London, the four decided to see what exciting sights Muggle London had to offer. They had just exited the British Museum, which held an impressive amount of objects that Lucy and Urza had found fascinating. Natsu and Gray, however, had been almost bored to tears and were now looking for something fun to do. I enjoyed that very much, Urza said with a smile as they walked down the street. Speak for yourself, Natsu replied. I don't think I've ever been so bored before. That's because you have no culture, Lucy sniffed. Culture? What's that? Natsu asked in mock seriousness, making the group laugh lightly. As they rounded the corner, Urza suddenly spotted a family walking to their car. That in itself wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the little boy who seemed to be limping closely behind the family and appeared to be wearing clothes that were 4 sizes too big for him. As Urza continued to watch the family, she began to notice other things about the family. The father was a rather large man with a wide mustache, while the woman was quite skinny and looked like a human-horse hybrid. The son was equally large and seemed to waddle after his father, but the limping boy looked almost impossibly thin, as though he hadn't eaten in some time. Urza's eyes narrowed as a suspicion began to plague her thoughts, which was amplified as she noticed a rather large bruise around the boy's neck that looked fresh. As the family approached a rather expensive-looking vehicle, Urza stared in shock as the T-man roughly grabbed the boy and said something to him that made the boy pale instantly before throwing the child into the back seat and slamming the door behind him. Urza, Natsu called. Hey Urza. Earth to Urza. What? Urza said in surprise as she turned back to her friends. What did you say? I asked if you wanted to grab a bite to eat before we made our way back to the hotel. It's our last day here. So I'm thinking we should try that pub we saw earlier. The food looked good. You go ahead, Urza replied, turning back to the fat man who was grumbling as he tried to get into his vehicle. I have another matter to look into first. Is everything okay? Lucy asked in a worried tone. I don't know, Urza replied softly, her eyes glued to the car. I just have a bad feeling about the man in that vehicle. The child with him looked like me. What do you mean? Gray asked. He looked like I did as a child, when I was abused and treated as a slave. Natsu looked sharply at the car. That had caught Urza's attention and a dark expression took over his face as he stared at it. Then we should follow them and see if you're right. Urza looked at Natsu with surprise for a moment. Bef. Or an expression of gratitude took over. Without another word, the four hailed a taxi and began following the car as it drove back to wherever it was going. Harry Potter shivered as he sat quietly in the back seat. It had started off as such a good day, but now that it was over, he felt fear rise in him as they got closer to Privet Drive. The Dursleys had decided to take Dudley to London for the day. And because no sitter could be found to watch Harry, he'd been allowed to come. It had been perhaps the best day of Harry's life with his adopted family. They went to a movie and then to an art gallery. Even though Dudley complained endlessly, Harry had thoroughly enjoyed looking at the pretty pictures as he was rarely, if ever, allowed to go anywhere with the Dursleys. In the 5 years that Harry had lived with them, he had never been allowed to go anywhere with his relatives. Instead, he was kept hidden and only allowed out to do his chores or when his uncle needed to beat him to relieve some stress or because he did something wrong. Things had gone wrong, as they always did. Towards the end of the day, however, the Dursleys had been eating lunch after the art gallery when Doodle EY decided he was still hungry and demanded that Harry hand over the meager sandwich that Vernon had been forced to buy him when the waiter asked what Harry would like. Harry had been so hungry from act of food that he had foolishly told Dudley no, resulting in Harry's cousin turning red with anger and attempting to snatch it from Harry's plate. Harry, in an act of desperation and hunger, had accidentally used the freaky stuff, and caused Dudley to fly backward out of his chair. His uncle Vernon had immediately paid their bill and dragged Harry out of the restaurant. Once they were outside, Vernon had told Harry that he would be receiving the worst beating of his life once they got home before roughly shoving the frightened boy into the car. Now Harry stared out the window at the passing city, desperately trying not to cry as they got closer to Privet Drive. He knew what would happen if he cried. The Dursleys hated it when he cried, and it would only make things worse if he did so. When they finally pulled into the driveway of the Dursleys' house, Harry nearly sobbed as he imagined what was about to happen to him. A moment later, he was ripped from the backseat and dragged inside by his uncle before being thrown to the floor as Vernon slammed the door behind him. Dudley smirked down at Harry before making his way to the kitchen with Harry's Aunt Petunia, who sneered at her EPHEW before raising her nose in the air and following her son. Please, Harry said in a soft whimper, I didn't mean to. I don't care, Vernon snarled as he took off his belt. I take you into my house out of the goodness of my heart. And you attack my son in return. This will teach you, freak. A moment later, the beating began, and Harry tried not to cry out as it would only make it worse. His resolve only lasted a few minutes before he begged his uncle to stop. Urza scowled in disgust as she paid the taxi driver and looked at the house that the fat man and his family had just entered. Every house was exactly alike, right down to the hedges, and it was disturbing, to be perfectly honest. Sheesh, this place is eerie, Natsu groaned as their taxi took off. Everything is the same. Looks like the sort of place a cult would live, Gray joked. Let's just do what we came here for and leave, Lucy said. This place is giving me the creeps. Before anything else could be said, a cry split the air, making the group stop in their tracks and stare in horror at the house in front of them. Urza suddenly sprinted to the window and looked inside to try and see what was happening. What she saw, however, was a nightmare. The small boy she had seen earlier was being savagely beaten with a belt by the fat man. The boy was sobbing and begging for the man to stop, but the man seemed to Be enjoying hurting the child and showed no sign that he would be stopping anytime soon. With a roar of outrage, Urza activated her armor, transforming the blue sundress she had been wearing into Heart Crew's armor, before smashing through the front door, making the fat man turn in shock just in time to see Urza's fist slam into his face and throw him off his feet and into the nearby wall. A second later, she was holding the small child in her arms and gazing in horror at the injuries that the fat man had inflicted on him. "Shish, it's okay," Urza said softly as she rocked the boy back and forth. "It's over now. He won't hurt you again, I promise." "Urza, what are you doing?" Lucy yelled as she ran through the front door, closely followed by Natsu and Gray. "We're not allowed to use magic in front of the— What are they called again?" "Muggles," Gray responded, making Lucy nod. "Yeah, them," Lucy continued. "We could get into a lot of trouble for this." "I don't care," Urza snarled. Look what they were doing to him." As Urza turned to her friends, they gasped in horror. The little boy was sobbing in Urza's arms and appeared to be covered in bruises from where the fat man had been beating him. Gray turned pale at the sight, while Lucy collapsed to her knees and began crying in horror. Natsu, on the other hand, looked pissed and ready to murder someone. Luckily there was someone available that was slowly climbing to his feet from where Urza had sent him flying. "You did this to that little kid." Natsu spat in barely contained rage. "What the hell is wrong with you? I can do whatever I want with the little freak. He's my property." The fat man spat back angrily. "Now, I don't know who you all are, but I demand you leave at once. Please." The little boy, in Urza's arms, whispered through his sobs, "Please don't leave me." "Don't worry, sweetheart," Urza whispered back, "we're not going anywhere." "Property," Gray snarled. "He a kid, you jackass. He's a freak." The fat man snarled. "Left here by other freaks because no one else wants him. So, I'll do with him as I please. Now, hand him over and get out. We're not leaving him here with you." "Lou," Sai cried with angry tears as she jumped to her feet and stormed towards him, only to be held back at the last minute by Gray. "He's coming with us." Vernon roared in rage at that and attempted to GE at Lucy but was promptly sent flying through the living room wall by Natsu a moment later. "Vernon, what's going on?" the horsewoman asked as she walked into the hallway before screaming in terror. As she took in the 4 strangers in her house, followed by the sight of her husband lying unconscious in the living room after having been seemingly sent through the hallway wall. "Who are you?" horsewoman shrieked. "What have you done to my husband?" "Just gave him a small taste of what he did to the kid," Gray responded angrily. "You hurt him too." Horsewoman paled at the words as Natsu turned his attention to her and took a step forward. "Gray asked you a question. Did you hurt the kid as well?" "And no. My husband is the one who would always punish the freak." "Don't call him that, Lucy snarled as she backhanded the horsewoman and sent her sprawling to the ground. "He's a little boy who your husband nearly beat to death for no reason whatsoever. This boy needs medical attention," Urza said as she rose to her feet. The child held carefully in her arms. "We're leaving." "Wait," the boy said in a soft voice. "My dear. Where is it, sweetie?" Urza asked softly. The boy weakly raised his hand and pointed at a small doorway at the foot of the stairs, which seemed to have a lock on the outside and made Urza narrow her eyes in suspicion as she approached. "Stay out of there," horsewoman yelled as she tried to rise to her feet, only for Natsu to kick her in the chest and place his foot there, holding her down. "I'd stay still if I were you," Natsu growled, making the horseshoe Oman pale as she watched Urza slowly open the cupboard. Urza stared in horror as she looked into the cupboard. It was a horror show that reminded her of how she had been forced to live as a child, and it took her a moment to regain her composure. The inside stunk of human excrement and dried blood. Spots of blood dotted the interior floor, and in the far back lay a small cot, upon which sat a small stuffed stag. Careful not to drop the boy, Urza grabbed the stuffed animal, noticing a small message written on the wall in green crayon that read, "Harry's room." Horror ran through Urza as she LLED out of the tiny space and handed the stag to the little boy in her arms, who hugged it as tight as he could. "Harry, is that your name?" Urza asked softly. Harry sniffled. "It's a good name," Urza replied softly as she ran a soft hand gently through his hair. "Is this where you sleep, Harry?" Harry said nothing, just nodded, and Urza felt a wave of pure rage course through her as she turned to the horsewoman, who was still trapped under Natsu's foot and staring at Urza with fear. "You are a disgusting piece of filth," Urza said in a cold voice. "You deserve to suffer every cruel tie that you have inflicted upon this poor boy, and I shall make sure that you do." The horsewoman shook with terror at Urza's words and was about to respond when Natsu lifted his foot and brought it down on her head, with just enough force to knock her unconscious but not enough to kill her. "Call the authorities," Urza said as she turned to Gray. "They must be made aware of these monsters' activities. And the kid, I'll not leave him here," Urza answered as Harry fell asleep in her arms from fatigue and the pain of his wounds. "He comes with us." "But what happens when the authorities ask about him?" Lucy asked softly, fresh tears running down her cheeks as she took in what lay in the cupboard. "They will no doubt think that those beasts killed him," Urza responded simply, "which will ensure that those monsters are giving their just rewards for what they have done." "Are you sure about this?" Natsu asked. "Master Makarov won't be happy when we show up at Fairy Tale with a kid from Earth. Once we tell him what happened here, he will understand, I'm sure," Urza replied as she gazed down sadly at the little boy in her arms. "Now, hurry up and make the call, Gray. This kid needs medical attention. And we must be gone before anyone sees us." Gray nodded and quickly made his way to the phone before making the call and hanging up a moment later. "It's done. Now, let's get out of here." The four quickly ran out of the door and across the street as sirens rang out in the distance. Quickly, Lucy pulled a black key from her pocket and held it in the sky before shouting, "Return." Instantly, all five disappeared in a blinding flash of light just as four police cars stopped in front of the Dursleys' house. Upon searching, the police found two unconscious adults and a terrified 6-year-old who would tell them that monsters had attacked his parents before fleeing just before the police arrived. Further inspection of the house would reveal a nightmare of abuse that another little boy had been forced to endure at the hands of those who should have protected said boy. It would result in both adult Dursleys being sent to prison for child abuse and murder, though both would deny killing little Harry Potter. Not that anyone believed them, that is. Far away in a castle in Scotland, an old man wearing purple robes and sporting a long white beard was reading a letter sent to him from the Minister of Magic when suddenly one of the many devices on his bookshelf let out a shrill whistle and promptly exploded. Dumbledore immediately jumped to his feet and sprang to the device as the color left his face, leaving him looking pale and horrified. This particular device was created with a singular purpose, to monitor a small boy named Harry Potter and to inform Dumbledore if ever the boy should be in trouble. The fact that it had exploded told the aged wizard that not only was Harry in danger, but also he wasn't even on Earth anymore. Quick as a flash, Dumbledore rated to Privet Drive in time to see Vernon Dursley being roughly shoved into the back of a Muggle police car as he shouted and raged incoherently. A moment later, Petunia Dursley was dragged kicking and screaming from her home by two police officers, likewise screaming incoherently. Quickly using a spell to hide his appearance so that he looked like an ordinary Muggle in a business suit, Dumbledore approached one of the onlookers and asked, "What happened?" "Terrible thing," the woman replied sadly. "Those two supposedly have been abusing a poor boy who lived with them." Dumbledore went pale in horror and softly whispered, "No." "Oh yes," the woman replied, "and apparently tonight, they went too far." "What do you mean?" Dumbledore asked, fear evident in his voice. "The police apparently found a cupboard where those two monsters were keeping the boy. The inside was covered in blood. They haven't found the body yet. They think that the Dursleys dumped the poor child somewhere." Dumbledore felt as though he might faint as the words hit him like blows. How did they discover what was going on?" "Anonymous tip, apparently," the woman replied. "Pity it didn't come sooner, though." Dumbledore nodded before turning and hurrying away, apparating back to Hogwarts once he was a safe distance from any witnesses. Once back, Dumbledore hurriedly rushed to a room that only the headmaster of Hogwarts was allowed to read. The Book of Admittance, which held the names of every witch and wizard to ever be accepted to Hogwarts. Quickly, Dumbledore turned the pages until he came to the year that Harry Potter was supposed to attend. Dumbledore felt a wave of relief course through him as he saw that the boy's name was still there, meaning that he was still alive. As the panic slowly began to leave his body, a troubling thought made its way into the old wizard's head. If Harry was still alive, then where was he? Perhaps the one who had called the Muggle police had taken the boy, and if that were the case, the child might still be in grave danger. Quickly, Dumbledore made his way back to his office. He needed to summon the Order immediately and send them out to search for Harry. It was Dumbledore's fault that the poor boy had been sent to live with the Dursleys, but he could hopefully rectify his mistake by finding Harry before something worse happened. Urza stared at the sleeping boy silently. The Wizards of Earth believed that the only way to enter or leave their world from Fury was through the gate, and the Magic Council had been happy to let the fools in the wizarding world believe that. The truth, however, was that the people of Fury had discovered not long after the gate appeared that they could leave Earth whenever they wanted, as long as they had a special black key tied to Fiore's magic. When this key was used, along with a simple passcode unique to each holder, it would allow those of Fury to leave Earth anytime they chose, making the gate useless. Upon arriving back in Fury, Urza and the three others had immediately taken Harry to the nearest hospital, and the doctors had immediately taken Harry in for examination. Several hours later, the doctors returned and explained that Harry had suffered unimaginably at the hands of the fat man and the horsewoman. Several of his bones had needed to be rebroken and properly set as they had healed in the wrong place. In addition, nearly 11% of the poor boy's body was covered in scar tissue from the years of abuse he had endured at the hands of those two monsters he had lived with. The more Urza heard, the angrier she became until, at last, the doctor thankfully stopped, and she was allowed to go and see Harry. Now she sat in the chair next to the boy's bed, silently staring at him, while Natsu, Gray, and Lucy sat next to each other, fast asleep on the room's only available couch. Suddenly, Harry began to moan in his sleep and twitch violently, making Urza gently run her hand through his hair, which seemed to calm him. Slowly, Harry's eyes opened, and he stared at Urza's red hair for a moment before whispering, "Mummy." Urza felt her breath catch in her throat at that, but before she could answer, Harry had fallen back asleep, and Urza felt a sad smile spread across her face. "It's okay, Harry," Urza said softly as she ran her hands through his hair. "Mummy's here, now." With that simple statement, Urza made up her mind. She would adopt this boy and raise him as her own. She, more than anyone, knew what this boy had gone through, for she, too, had once been a slave and been beaten and abused. Harry needed someone to love him and show him what it meant to be cared for, and Urza was determined to be that woman. As Urza gently stroked the boy's hair, she felt a wave of love course through her that had happy tears running down her face. "Mummy's here, Harry," she whispered softly, making the boy smile and lean into her touch. Author's note: this idea came to me while I was working on the newest chapter for my other fanfic, Under the Raven's Wing, and it is one I would like to continue one day, but since I'm already working on 4 at the moment, I'm storing it here until I have a chance to return to it. The Dragon and the Wizard. The Dragon and the Wizard summary. Harry Potter has lived most of his life in constant pain and fear, mistakenly believing that the Dursleys are his only family. When his uncle Vernon is sent to NYC for business, he takes the whole family, and Harry discovers that he's not as alone as he first suspected. Chapter 1. The Dursley family was one that most considered well-to-do. They kept both their house and yard immaculate and seemed to go out of their way to appear even more normal than the rest of their neighborhood. Vernon Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was a large, beefy man with hardly any chin, though he did have an enormous mustache, and his favorite pastime was yelling at people, mostly those unfortunate to work under him. Petunia Dursley was almost the complete antithesis of her husband. She was a tall woman with twice the amount of neck of her husband, Wick. H came in handy as her favorite hobby was spying on the neighbors in her never-ending quest for gossip. Dudley Dursley was their only son, and in their eyes, there was no more remarkable child in all of the world. Though if you were to ask the neighborhood children, they would quickly disabuse anyone who might share that opinion. To those who knew him, really knew him, Dudley Dursley was a bully and a brat. His favorite hobby was to pick on those weaker than him, and if he was ever caught in the act, he made sure that his friends would always back his side of the story, that it was all his victim's fault. To all the world, it seemed as though the Dursley were the perfect dull family, and it was a facade that they desperately tried to maintain, despite their desperation for normality. The Dursleys also had a secret that would ruin them if it ever got out. That secret just so happened to be a 7-year-old boy named Harry Potter. Harry was the son of Petunia's sister and had been dropped on their doorstep 6 years prior when Harry's mother and father had died. With no other family to go to, Harry had unfortunately been left to the tender mercies of his aunt and uncle. For the next 6 years, poor Harry's life was one of constant misery. He was forced to sleep in a cupboard under the stairs and perform every chore that popped into his aunt and uncle's mind. When he wasn't being worked like a slave, Harry was forced to endure abuses at the hands of his cousin, Dudley, who seemed determined to make Harry's life as miserable as possible. At school, Harry had no friends. Oz Dudley and his gang had made clear that Harry was to be avoided at all costs. Anyone who ignored this unspoken rule suffered at the hands of Dudley and his gang. Due to lies from his aunt and uncle about him, the teachers at Harry's school didn't treat Harry much better, viewing him as a delinquent who was unjustly dropped on his poor relative's doorstep after his drunk father crashed the car he was driving, thereby killing Harry's mother and father. The fact that the Dursleys forced Harry to wear Dudley's old things didn't help Harry correct this incorrect assumption of him. Rather, they made Harry seem even more pathetic. If that were possible, as Dudley was easily 3 times bigger than Harry, and so his cousin's clothes hung over his tiny frame. For 6 long years, Harry had been without hope of ever being treated the way that he watched his aunt and uncle treat Dudley. All Harry wanted was to be loved, to have someone hold him the way that his Aunt Petunia fawned over Dudley. Yet as the years passed, Harry began to understandably accept that his life would never be that way. Unknown to all, fate was about to give Harry the thing he wanted most, and it would come in the most unexpected place of all, New York City. Vernon Dursley was delighted as he drove his company car home. The vice president had stopped by Vernon's office this morning and offered Vernon a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Vernon had been hand-picked to go to New York City to negotiate a deal for Grunnings that could prove very lucrative. The only drawback was that the trip would require Vernon to stay in New York for at least 3 months, perhaps even 4. Unwilling to let such an opportunity slip by, Vernon immediately accepted. Seeing as it was summer, the vice president even granted Ronan's request to bring his family with him to New York. Vernon had nearly passed out from happiness when the vice president had told Vernon that he and his family would be staying in a very luxurious hotel while Vernon sealed the necessary deal, and now he was eagerly racing home to tell his wife and son the good news. As he pulled into his driveway, Vernon's eye caught sight of his nephew pulling weeds. Instantly, Vernon's good mood vanished as he stared at the emaciated boy. Vernon only hoped that he or Petunia could find someone to look after that brat, because he would not allow the little freak to ruin Vernon's golden opportunity for advancement and the rewards that would follow if he could successfully close this deal. With a grunt of frustration, Vernon heaved his weight out of the car and began to quickly stride towards his front door. There had better not be a single weed out here when I come for my inspection, boy. Vernon snarled at his nephew before opening the door and walking inside, not waiting for his nephew's reply. Pet, Vernon called as he entered the house and began looking for his wife. Petunia, dear. Where are you? I have great news. I'm in the kitchen, Vernon. Petunia called out. I'm just making Dudley his afternoon meal. Quickly striding into the kitchen, Vernon smiled as wide as he could as he took in his family. His wife was currently stacking a veritable mountain of macaroni and cheese onto a place for his son, who was sitting at the table playing some sort of portable video game with a bored look on his face. I have news, my love. Verno, N said happily as he slapped his hands together and rubbed them eagerly. The vice president of Grunnings has hand-picked me to go to New York City to help close a deal that could very well make or break our future. Vernon, that's wonderful, Petunia said happily as she sat the plate of food in front of Dudley before walking over and giving Vernon a peck on the cheek. Dudley turned off his game, gave his parents an unimpressed look, and took his meal upstairs to his room. That's not all, Vernon beamed, because it's summer. I got the VP's permission to take you all with me. We'll be staying at a very luxurious hotel until the deal is done, paid for by the company, of course. For a moment, Petunia beamed, then a thought entered her head, and her smile turned into a very ugly scowl. Vernon, we can't, Petunia retorted. We have no one to watch the freak, and we can't very well leave him here alone, can we? We'll leave him with Mrs. Fig, Vernon said simply, unwilling to let the brat ruin his plans. She's gone for the summer, Petunia replied with a sneer. Gone? Vernon asked angrily. Gone where? I've no idea, Petunia replied, just that she said she would be gone until summer ends. What about Marge? She's still in France, Vernon grumbled. There has to be someone that can look after him. 2 hours later, a distraught Vernon and Petunia Dursley were sitting at their dining room table. They had both called every number in their respective address books, and unfortunately, no one was willing or available to watch a child for close to 4 months. I suppose that's it, then, Vernon spat. We'll have to take the little freak with us to New York City. Oh, Vernon, we can't. Petunia wailed. The boy will ruin everything. What do we do if he does some of his freakishness? He won't, Vernon replied darkly, because I'll make sure that he knows what will happen if he does. Luong Lao Shi sighed sadly as he sat down on a box. To most of the world at large, he was a simple store owner. Only a few knew that he was also a dragon, as well as the former dragon in charge of protection of magical China when he had been a younger man. Luong Lao Shi was a diminutive Asian man with somewhat pointed ears and thinning white hair, thick eyebrows, a Fu Manchu mustache, and a soul-patch beard. The strangest thing about him was his choice of dress, as he was wearing a dark blue robe with yellow trimmings on the sleeves and hem. To everyone else, Luong was simply an eccentric old man, and it was a carefully guarded charade that Luong enjoyed playing. He and his dog Fu had been cleaning the attic of his shop when he had discovered a long-forgotten box hidden in a seldom-visited part of the attic. Inside, Luong Lao Shi had found a picture that he had long thought lost, showing the child he had given up for adoption many years before. 27 years prior, Luong had been sent by the Dragon Council to England to help the English dragon with a particular problem that he was unable to do alone. While there, Luong Lao Shi met a beautiful woman. Things had progressed far faster than either of them had intended, and a few months later, the woman had informed Luong Lao Shi that she was pregnant. Luong had been a very different man back then, and unable to properly care for a child. He had agreed with the woman when she suggested that they put the baby up for adoption. The last time that Luong had seen his daughter was the day she had been born, the day this photo was taken, the day that he had given her the only thing he could, a name, Lily. As Luong stared at the photo, he felt his heartstrings stir with long-forgotten pain. At the time, it had seemed like such a good idea to give the poor girl up for adoption, but now he wished he had chosen differently. He had gotten married and raised a family of his own since he had given his first daughter up, and Luong was pleased with his family, yet he couldn't help but wonder what had become of his little lily flower. Luong couldn't tell what it was, but he felt that something was coming and that it would have dire ramifications for not only his family but also for the world, try as he might. Luong couldn't shake the feeling as he stared at the picture clutched in his hand. Hey, Gramps, a voice called from downstairs. Where are you? We were supposed to start our training like 30 minutes ago. We will start training when Grandpa is ready. Luong yelled back as he gently placed the photo into the box and rose to his feet. You need more training in patience. Ah, man, the voice replied as Luong slowly made his way down the attic stairs. Harry smiled happily as the stewardess brought him his dinner, which consisted of chicken nuggets, corn, and mashed potatoes. He knew it might be the only time he would ever be allowed to eat like this, so he was happily eating as much as he could. The Dursleys had told Harry a week ago that they would be dragging him with him to America, but had almost immediately warned him about what would happen if he did anything freakish. Even with the threat hanging over his head, Harry was happier than he had ever been, even as he sat in coach while his relatives enjoyed first class. Harry had never been allowed to join the Dursleys when they went on holiday. He'd always been forced to stay with Vernon's sister, Marge, or else stay with Mrs. Fig and her nauseating army of cats. This was why Harry was determined to be on his best behavior during his trip to America. If he showed that he was a good boy during his uncle's trip, he might be treated better when they returned to England. Of course, it was a vain hope, but Harry held onto it with all the intensity that a 7-year-old boy could muster. 8 hours later, Harry and the Dursleys made their way out of the airport with their luggage, Dudley had needed 3 suitcases for everything he wanted to bring. Meanwhile, Harry had a single backpack slung across his shoulders as he didn't have enough to need anything else. After a long drive from the airport to the hotel that Vernon's company had footed the bill for, Harry found himself staring open-mouthed at their room. Vernon's company had apparently spared no expense as they had reserved a 2-story penthouse for the Dursley family. Because there was more than enough room for both Dudley and everything he brought with him, Vernon had grudgingly agreed to let Harry have his own room for the duration of the trip, and Harry very nearly cried as he lay on his own bed for the first time. As Harry enjoyed the fresh smell of his sheets, his uncle suddenly opened the door and stepped inside, causing Harry to jump in surprise as Vernon glared down at him. "We're going out," Vernon growled. "We are?" Harry asked, then immediately regretted it as his uncle smacked him across the back of the head for ignoring the "no questions" rule. As Harry lay groaning on the floor, Vernon sneered at him. "Not you, boy, your aunt, cousin, and I," Vernon clarified. "You are to stay in this room until we return, is that clear? That means no ordering room service or watching television, you just stay put. If I come back here and find that you disobeyed me, I'll make you wish you had never been born." As Vernon slammed the door shut and stomped back to his waiting family, he missed the way Harry sniffled and muttered under his breath, "I already do." Quote, several hours later, after a scrumptious dinner that left everyone satisfied, especially since the meal was on someone else's dime, the Dursleys clambered happily into a taxi. After a day of sightseeing and a delicious dinner, they were looking forward to enjoying a hot shower before bed, even if the freak was still there. "Bloody good start, Vernon chuckled. "And we've got 4 more months here. Too bad we have to share it with the boy," Petunia sniffed. "Not to worry, pet," Vernon said contemptuously. "If he puts a single toe out of line, I'll make him rue the day his parents popped him out into the world." So caught up in their own black thoughts and cruel laughter that they failed to see the truck that ran through the red light and collided with the side of their taxi. The cab flipped 3 times before coming to rest upside down. By the time emergency services managed to arrive and transport the cab driver and his 3 customers to the hospital, it was too late. "Hey, Gramps, can we take a break?" Jake Long asked his grandfather, who was serenely resting in a lawn chair in the shade, a glass of sweet tea sitting on the table next to him, for the past 2 hours. Jake had been forced to balance on his tail as he sat in a meditative pose, and needless to say, he was exhausted. Ordinarily, Jake would be in his human form, and when so, he looked like a younger version of his grandfather. He was short for his age, with spiky black hair which had green highlights. His dress of choice was simple, with a white shirt under a red jacket and blue shorts. His dragon form seemed to match his human one. When in dragon form, he was tall and muscular, with scaled red wings, green spikes that ran down his back, and a yellow underbelly. Only his black and green hair remained the same, no matter what form he chose. "Take a break," Grandpa scoffed back, not even bothering to open his eyes. "It's only been 2 hours. When I was your age, I could go for days and not get tired. Kids these days are too soft," Fu agreed from where he sat beside Grandpa, likewise serenely resting in the shade. "Come on, Gramps," Jake complained. "What's balancing on my tail in the hot sun while you and Fu relax in the shad supposed to teach me how to be the next American dragon?" "Fool," Grandpa yelled back, "to be the next American dragon requires a sharp mind and a strong fist. If you cannot even sit still and contemplate, how will you do your job?" "Aw man," Jake sighed before trying to focus and meditate again. Harry bit his lip as he anxiously jumped from foot to foot, trying to decide what to do. It had been nearly 2 days since the Dursleys had left, and Harry hadn't seen them since, too afraid of what his uncle would do to him if Harry disobeyed. The boy had stayed in his room the entire time. Hunger and thirst were now making their presence known, and Harry faced an agonizing choice: leave the room and try and find some food, or stay in the room and die. Each option carried the same amount of danger, for if Uncle Vernon found Harry out of his room, he might just as easily kill him as hunger would. Finally, after an interminable amount of time, Harry reached out and slowly turned the doorknob, wincing as the door opened with a loud creak. As silently as he could, Harry stepped out of his room and into the penthouse. To Harry's surprise, The penthouse was as dark and silent as it had been since the Dursleys left 2 days prior. Gathering his courage, Harry crept to the kitchen and opened the fridge for food and water. As the fridge popped open, Harry jumped back in shock, for a giant bug had flown out of the fridge. As it shook the cold off of it, Harry felt his jaw drop in awe as his eyes beheld a light blue fairy, with the most beautiful pair of wings that Harry had ever seen. "Oh, thank you, little one," the fairy said as it turned to face Harry. "I've been stuck in there since the last guests accidentally shut me in." "You're so pretty," Harry breathed in awe, making the fairy giggle and turn pink. "Ah, you're adorable, aren't you?" the fairy said, flashing a warm smile at Harry. "What are you doing here alone, sweetie?" "My aunt and uncle went to dinner and told me to stay in my room until they got back," Harry mumbled softly, his voice turning toward pleading as he continued. "But that was 2 days ago, and I know I was supposed to stay in my room, but I'm so hungry, so please don't tell them, Ms. Fairy." "Now, enough of that," the fairy said soothingly as it flew closer to Harry. "There's no reason to cry, little one. I'm certainly not mad at you for going to look for food." The fairy crossed her arms, and an annoyed look came across her face as she continued talking. "If anything, I'm mad at your relatives for leaving you here. Who leaves a child alone for 2 days with no food?" Before anyone could say anything else, Harry's stomach gave a loud rumble, making the boy rub his belly sadly as the fairy giggled. "I can find you some food if you promise to wait here," the fairy said with a smile that made Harry feel all warm inside. "I can do that, Ms. Fairy," Harry said shyly, making the fairy giggle again before flying out of the window and out of sight. Jake was finally allowed to change back into his human form by his grandpa when a tiny blue fairy flew up to him. Looking torn between worry and fury, instantly, Grandpa was standing next to Jake as the fairy began to speak. "American Dragon, you must come quick." "What's up?" Jake asked, all his soreness melting away in an instant. "There's a child all alone and hungry." The fairy replied quickly. "They left him alone 2 days ago." "What kind of parent leaves a child alone for 2 days?" Jake asked Ngrilly as he quickly transformed into his dragon form. Jake's grandpa did the same beside him, and Fu jumped onto Grandpa's back. "Not everyone is worthy of having a child in their care, Jake, Grandpa said sadly before turning to the waiting fairy. "Take us to him." Nodding quickly, the fairy sped off back toward the hotel, Jake and Grandpa flying after her as quickly as they could. A few moments later, the fairy flew into the open window of a nearby hotel, which made Jake's eyes widen in surprise. "Yo, with this kind of money, you would think they could afford to look after their kid." "Indeed," Grandpa grumbled as the two flew into the window after the fairy, where a scared-looking child awaited them. "Dragons," Harry said, his voice torn between fear and awe. "Dragons are real." "Sure are, kid," Fu said with a grin as he jumped off of Grandpa's back, making Harry's eyes go so wide that it looked as though they would pop out. "A talking doggy," Harry whispered in awe. Fu winked at Harry, causing the boy to giggle, even as his tiny hands worriedly wrung the front of his shirt. "So, what's your name, little guy?" Fu asked. Harry." Harry mumbled softly, suddenly going shy and making the fairy squeal at how cute he had become. "Well, Harry, what are you doing here all by yourself?" Jake asked as he shifted back into his human form, making the child's eyes widen. "Where are your parents?" Looking down at the ground, Harry mumbled sadly. "My mummy and daddy are dead." "I'm so sorry, kid," Fu replied sadly, "but who's been taking care of you, then?" "My aunt and uncle," Harry replied. And no one missed the way he shook with fear as he mentioned them. "But they're not very fond of me." "How do you mean, sweetie?" The fairy replied. "They don't hurt you, do they?" Biting his lip to keep himself from crying, Harry slowly nodded his head, making Grandpa and Fu growl angrily. "Where are they, child?" Grandpa asked as he transformed into his human form. "What are their names?" "I don't know where they are," Harry said softly. "They said that they were going to go to dinner, but that was 2 days ago, Mr. Dragon, sir. But their names are Petunia Dursley and Vernon Dursley. Oh, and there's my cousin, Dudley." Jake frowned at the names. They seemed very familiar, yet he couldn't figure out why. On the other hand, Fu seemed to go pale at the mention of the Dursleys and quickly motioned for the other two. Follow him out of Harry's hearing range. What's up, Fu? Jake asked in confusion. Those names, the Dursleys. I know where I've heard them from, Fu explained, glancing at Harry. Who was being tickled by the fairy? They died 2 days ago in a car accident. It was all over the news. Oh yeah, Jake said, snapping his fingers as the memory returned to him. I thought I had heard the name before. I just couldn't figure out where. Pity, Grandpa said gravely. Judging by the boys' appearance, they had much to answer for. Turning from the group, Grandpa studied Harry intently. The boy's green eyes had nearly taken Grandpa's breath away when he first saw them, for they reminded him so much of his long-lost daughter. Even the shape of the eyes was the same. And Grandpa couldn't help but wonder at the boy's origins. So, what do we do? Jake asked the room at large. Do we call the cops? They'll know what to do with the kid, surely. That might work if he was a regular kid. Fu replied, unfortunately, Harry here ain't a regular kid. What do you mean he's not a regular kid? Jake asked in confusion. He looks pretty regular to me. When I was looking at the kid, I noticed his scar, Fu explained. That kid's famous in the magical world. He is, Jake said in surprise. Who is he? Harry Potter, Fu said softly so that Harry wouldn't hear. Only person to ever survive being touched by the killing curse. Son of Lily Evans and her husband, James. Grandpa felt as though the wind is knocked out of him, and it took all his willpower not to crumple to his knees. After he had given his daughter up for adoption, he had changed his mind and went in search of her. It took him a few months, but he was finally able to track down his Lily Flower. Only to discover that she had already been adopted by a family named Evans. When he saw how happy his Lily Flower was, Grandpa decided to leave her there and sadly returned home. Do you remember how she died? Grandpa asked in a hollow voice that made the other turn to him with worry. Yeah, Fu said with a raised brow. She and her husband were involved in a war about a decade ago against a dark wizard named Voldemort. For some reason, Voldemort wanted the Potters dead bad, probably due to how many times they managed to escape him and his gang of idiots. Anyway, he finally managed to track them down to their house because one of their friends betrayed them and killed them both on Halloween 6 years ago now. Grandpa felt a tear run down his old face at the thought that his daughter was dead. Had been dead for nearly 6 years, and he hadn't even known. What was worse was that if Harry was indeed his grandson, then he had left the poor boy at the mercy of his relatives for 6 years to be beaten mercilessly. According to what I read, Fu continued, not having seen Grandpa's reaction, James Potter died first trying to fight Voldemort and give his wife and son time to escape. But Lily ended up trapped in her son's nursery, and Voldemort killed her there. No one knows what happened next. Only that when Voldemort tried to kill Harry, he couldn't, and it caused him to disappear somehow. Does it say what happened to Harry after that? Grandpa asked in a weary voice. No, Fu replied. Harry's magical guardian, Albus Dumbledore, took possession of him after that and wouldn't tell anyone where Harry was. Quote, Dumbledore, Grandpa growled, his teeth elongating for a moment. Grandpa had crossed paths with Dumbledore many times in the past, and each time made Grandpa despised the man all the more. Dumbledore was a devout follower of the greater good and was willing to do anything and sacrifice anyone to see that the greater good was served. If he was to blame for Harry's condition, Grandpa would happily tear the old bastard's beard out by the roots, and then he would get more inventive. So, is there like a magical police force we can call or? Jake said before Grandpa cut him off. No, he will come with us. Huh. Jake said in surprise, but why, Gramps? Because there is a chance that he is my grandson, Grandpa said solemnly, making everyone go silent with shock, including Harry, who had crept closer to see what was happening. You're kidding, right? Jake said in shock. How is that possible? Before I met your grandmother, I was involved with another woman, Grandpa said with a small smile as old memories flared up. It did not last, but it produced a child, a girl. We named her Lily before we put her up for adoption. Adoption, Jake said softly. Why? Neither of us was ready for the responsibility of a child, Grandpa replied sadly. We didn't want to but had little choice. So I made sure that Lily went to a good family, a family named Evans. Which was Lily Potter's maiden name, Fu said softly, which means if you're right. Harry is my grandson, Grandpa said softly, and your cousin, Jake. You're my grandpa, Harry asked softly, hardly daring to believe it might be true, really. Yes, Harry, Grandpa said warmly, there is a chance that I might very well be your grandfather. And if so, you would be most welcome to stay with me if you wanted to. Harry couldn't help but smile at the old man who could turn into a dragon, even as tears ran down the little boy's cheeks. He had found someone who wanted him, and no matter what he had to do in return, Harry would do it without question if it meant being taken away from the Dursleys. You promise? Harry asked, his voice shaking and making everyone look at him with pity. I'll do more than that. Grandpa smiled. I'll give you a sacred dragon's promise. Instantly, Grandpa transformed into his dragon form and extended his pinky claw toward Harry, who stared at him in awe again, slowly. Harry extended his own pinky and wrapped it around the blue dragon's claw. Now, hop on, little one. Grandpa said happily, let's go home and introduce you to your new family. As carefully as he could, Harry climbed onto Grandpa's back as Fu did the same to a shocked Jake. Once he was sure that Harry was secure, Grandpa jumped into the air and dove out of the window and into the sky as Harry squealed in delight. Anima Perdita summary. Harry and Marcus are twin brothers who have been on their own since they were 8 years old, after running away from the neglect of their parents and little sister, Rose. But when the truth of who actually destroyed Voldemort finally comes out, the wizarding world discovers that it actually needs the Potter twins. Forced to return to the people they hate most, will this broken family be able to repair what's been done, or will the wizarding world burn in the fires of vengeance? The meeting room was as as a tomb as everyone took in what Albus Dumbledore had just said. The only sound that could be heard was coming from a red-headed woman who was sobbing into the chest of her husband, a black-haired man who looked as though he too were fighting back the tears. Sitting beside her parents, looking heartbroken, was a teenager who looked the spitting image of her mother. The girl had her mother's fiery red skin and glowing green eyes. But where her mother's hair was sleek and straight, the girl's was bushy and chaotic. But how can that be possible? Sirius Black asked tightly. You assured us that Rose was the one. It would seem as though I was mistaken. Dumbledore replied wearily as he ran a hand over his old face. Mistaken, Lily hissed before lunging at the aged headmaster, only to be held back by her husband. Mistaken. You cost me, my sons. A sudden scoff made everyone turn to Severus Snape, sitting lazily in one of the nearby chairs. James and Sirius turned pink as they looked at their hated schoolmate. Really, Lily? Snape asked with a sneer. Did Dumbledore force you to laud adulation on one child while forgetting the other two? If so, then he is a most powerful wizard indeed. The Potters flinched as though Snape's words were physical blows, and Rose covered her face in her hands as she began to silently cry, her thoughts on her two big brothers that she had not seen in 6 years. A moment later, her best friend Hermione touched her shoulder as she tried to comfort Rose. The Potter family had been happy once, but that was before Voldemort had attacked their home in Godric's Hollow. Back then, Lily and James had treated all 3 of their children the same, with love and laughter. But that all changed after Voldemort's attack. Rose's grandmother, James's mother, had been watching the children while Lily and James attended an order meeting. When the Potters returned, they found 3 screaming children, one dead old woman near their crib. James had become inconsolable at the sight of his dead mother, and a bundle of black robes lying near the door. After being proclaimed the girl who lived, Rose was given everything, and her brothers almost nothing. Every Christmas, Rose would receive dozens of presents while Harry and Marcus would get 1 gift each if they were lucky. The same was said for birthdays if the Potters remembered Harry and Marcus's birthday at all. Needless to say that all this attention and praise went straight to Rose's head, and she quickly became a spoiled little brat who would constantly blame her 2 big brothers whenever she did something wrong, laughing as the twins were punished. But everything changed on Rose's 7th birthday when she had run into the twins' room to torment them by showing them her new broom that James had bought. To her surprise, the room was covered in a fine layer of dust, showing that no one had slept in there for some time. When Rose had run downstairs to tell everyone, at first, the Potters had looked confused before horror stole over their features at the recollection that they had not seen their sons in over 2 weeks. Immediately, A search was underway to find Harry and Marcus. But it seemed as though the two of them had simply vanished off of the face of the earth. Even Dumbledore, with all of his power and contacts, was unable to find the boys. Not long after, word reached the Daily Prophet about the two elder sons of House Potter running away due to receiving nothing but neglect at the hands of their parents. As Lily and James read the words, their hearts sank. As they realized that every word was accurate. The Potters' reputation took a significant hit after this, and even Rose was no longer looked at with awe by the masses. Now, the Potters were looked at with contempt by their enemies and disgust by nearly everyone else. Desperate to correct the sins of their past, Lily and James began to change the way that they treated Rose. No longer was she spoiled and given everything that her heart desired. Now she was raised the way she should have been from the start alongside her brothers, and slowly but surely Rose began to change into a better person. As the years passed, the Potters and the Order of the Phoenix never ceased their search for their sons, despite everyone else believing them dead, hoping to repair their reputation, and because no one else was willing to hire her for what she did, Lily applied for the post of Charms at Hogwarts, which Dumbledore happily obliged. A few years later, when Marcus and Harry would have turned 11, Lil Y had anxiously waited to see if her sons would be among the first years, only to weep in bitter disappointment when their names were called and no one stepped forward. Dumbledore tried to mollify the Potters by saying that the fact that the twins' names were called meant that they were still alive and that was a good thing, but even the knowledge that their boys were alive didn't assuage the feelings of grief and guilt that ran through them like wildfire. The following year, when Rose started her first year of Hogwarts, was hard on her. Nearly everyone knew what she and her parents had made the twin Potter boys do. And as a result, she was virtually shunned by the rest of her housemates, and the rest of Hogwarts in general. The fact that she was sorted into Gryffindor didn't help, as people demanded to know how she had tricked the Sorting Hat, as there was no way she belonged in the House of the Brave and Chivalrous. The only person to stand by her side was a Muggleborn named Hermione Granger. And the two quickly became best friends, which was good because, like Rose, Hermione too was being shunned by her housemates for no crime except being a know-it-all. If Rose expected a quiet year of learning, she was sorely mistaken. Her first year saw her fighting a troll, helping to smuggle an illegal dragon out of the country, and finally being forced to fight a Hogwarts professor who turned out to be possessed by the shade of Voldemort, in order to stop him from stealing an artifact that could potentially bring Voldemort back to power. Rose's reputation had grown and healed since her first year, as every year seemed to grow steadily worse and more dangerous, which only increased her reputation, though she no longer desired such a thing. Her second year, Rose had been even worse. If that was possible, when students began being petrified by some kind of monster that no one seemed able to find and destroy, Rose's parents, having already lost 2 children, demanded that Rose have someone with her at all times until the beast was slain. Things had grown more volatile throughout the year until finally coming to a head when Hermione became another victim. A first year, named Ginny Weasley, was then abducted by the monster and taken into the Chamber of Secrets, where the monster allegedly lived. Having spent most of the year investigating and researching, Rose managed to figure out where the entrance of the chamber was by deducing that Moaning Myrtle, a ghost who haunted a girl's bathroom, had been, in fact, one of the monster's victims 50 years earlier. After a careful search, Rose discovered a tiny snake carved into one of the faucets, but no matter what she did, it just would not open for her. It was only when Rose kicked the sink angrily, hurting her foe as a result and hopping around hissing obscenities, that the sink rose into the air and the entrance showed itself. Unfortunately, that was as far as Rose got, as her parents, along with her godfather Sirius and Headmaster Dumbledore, burst into the bathroom. Her parents had nearly lost their minds when they discovered that she wasn't in her room and had promised swift and brutal punishment for stupidly thinking about going into the chamber alone. Ordering her to remain with her mother, James, Dumbledore, and Sirius dove into the entrance to rescue Ginny and kill the beast. An hour later, the Y returned with an unconscious Ginny in Dumbledore's arms, covered in blood and, strangely, ink, and all looked exhausted and pale, as though they had seen something truly nightmarish. Rose didn't know what they faced down there, as none of them would ever speak about it, but whatever it was had truly scared her father, and that alone scared Rose. Once word slipped out that Rose had found the chamber and led Dumbledore to it. She became an instant celebrity again, much to her disgust as she didn't enjoy fame like she used to. Ron Weasley, a boy in Rose's year who had never spoken to her except to insult her, approached her and apologized for how he had treated her before. He then gratefully thanked Rose for saving his little sister before heading back to his seat next to Ginny. Rose's third year was thankfully calm, and nothing out of the ordinary happened, save for her father becoming the new flying teacher. Rose had mistakenly believed that the worst was over and had thoroughly enjoyed her third year with more friends than just Hermione to associate with, though the bushy-haired witch was still counted as Rose's best friend. Rose's previous year, her fourth, had been the worst one of her life. Her name had somehow been placed in the Goblet of Fire, and she had been forced to participate in an incredibly dangerous tournament. Her parents had been livid with rage and had tried everything in the repertoire to get Rose out of it, all to no effect. The year had gotten steadily worse when reporter Rita Skeeter had begun to lambaste Rose and her parents continuously. After writing an article about Marcus and Harry that seemed to imply that Lily and James killed them and hidden their bodies somewhere, Lily finally decided that enough was enough and confronted Rita Skeeter. Rose didn't know what her mother had said. But the next day Rita had quit the Daily Prophet and swiftly vanished. Things came to a head at the end of the Triwizard Tournament when Rose was abducted via P. Ortke and her blood used in a ritual that brought Voldemort back to life. As Rose sat tied to the tombstone that she was against, she never felt more afraid in her life and desperately wished her big brother were there to save her. As expected of a megalomaniac, Voldemort couldn't help but give a speech as he repeatedly crucioed Rose, talking about how the world and Dumbledore in particular had made a horrible mistake. Amid the sounds of her own screams, Rose heard with growing horror how it hadn't been her who had defeated Voldemort, but instead it had been Marcus and Harry. When their grandmother had died for them, it had created an impenetrable shield that made them untouchable. When Voldemort tried to kill the two of them, his spell bounced back and destroyed him instead. When Rose had finally been released from the pain of the torture curse, she couldn't help but remember the strange scar that both twins had on their foreheads in the shape of a lightning bolt, only the placement of the scars differed, with Marcus's being over his right eye, and Harry's being over his left. Apparently tired of playing with his food, Voldemort raised his wand to kill the weeping girl that lay before him when Dumbledore and an army of Aurors, led by her uncle Sirius, suddenly appeared, and the battle ensued. Apparently out of practice, the Death Eaters had begun to fall, one after another, as Voldemort dueled Dumbledore. Seeing that he would lose if he stayed, Voldemort had ordered an immediate retreat, and Rose was quickly taken to St. Mungo's for treatment. That had been a week ago. Now, the Minister of Magic, Cornelius Fudge, had tried to cover up the Dark Lord's return, but with so many Aurors having seen him in action, it soon proved impossible, and he was forced to admit that Voldemort had indeed returned. Since then, Voldemort and his Death Eaters had been quiet, with only a few raids here and there. According to Snape, Voldemort was more concerned with finding the twins had destroyed him than terrorizing a few muggles. After convening the Order of the Phoenix, Dumbledore was forced to explain why the Dark Lord was so interested in two runaways. Needless to say, he result left more than one person glaring at Dumbledore in disgust and anger. "So, what you're saying is that we're screwed," Tonks said with a grimace, making everyone turn to her in surprise. "What do you mean?" Sirius asked with a raised brow. "Even if we find them, what makes you think they would willingly want to come back and fight for us?" Tonks sneered. "After how they were treated, I wouldn't be surprised if they decided to join you." "No who?" Everyone in the room paled at the implication that through their own fault, they might have inadvertently caused the only ones who could defeat Voldemort to join him instead. Dumbledore, Lily, and James turned so white that they looked like ghosts as they realized what they had done, and Dumbledore seemed to age right before their eyes. "Harry and Marcus wouldn't do that," Rose cried angrily as she jumped from her seat. "And how exactly do you know that?" Tonks countered. "They left because of you and your parents. Who knows how much have changed in the 6 years since they've last been seen." Rose opened her mouth to retort when the door to the meeting room opened with a loud bang as it shot open and banged against the wall as a horribly scarred wizard limped in. "Remus." James and Sirius asked in shock as the wizard strode up to the table and took his place beside Dumbledore. It had been almost 6 years since James and Sirius had seen their old friend. And from his haggard appearance, the years had not been kind to him. Blaming the Potters and Dumbledore for the twins' disappearance and further angered by how long it took them to realize that the twins were gone, Remus had cut all ties with his former friends and left in search of his pups. "It's good to see you, old friend," Sirius said with a warm smile that promptly dropped when Remus turned to him and gave a look so cold that it seemed to freeze the room. "Wish I could say the same," Remus replied with a sneer. "I'm only here to ensure that my pups are taken care of. And seeing as how no one here can be trusted to do that, it falls to me." The room seemed to flinch as one as Remus' words, no one more so than the Potters and Sirius, who looked down in shame, unable to meet their former friend's eyes. "Do you know where they are?" Lily asked desperately a moment later, causing Remus to turn his cold eyes to her and seemingly freeze her in place. "Yes," Remus replied after a moment of silence, "I finally managed to track them down." "And," James cried desperately as the room held its breath, "where are they?" "Where are my boys?" "They're not yours," Remus sneered, causing James to turn pink angrily. "You proved that a long time ago, Potter." James flinched for a moment at the use of his last name from his friend before anger replaced shame, and he took a step forward menacingly. "You tell me where my children are, or so help me." James snapped. "You'll what?" Remus growled, his eyes flashing wolf yellow as he turned fully towards his former friends. "What will you do?" "Potter, that's enough," Dumbledore roared, causing the room to jump. "We are all to blame for what happened. I can only pray that the twins will be able to forgive us." "Not bloody likely," Remus scoffed as he reached into his coat for something. "What do you mean?" Lily asked desperately. "Harry and Marcus are not the same children that you remember, Remus replied as he pulled out a copy of a French Muggle newspaper that showed a picture from what looked like a security camera. The photo showed two figures dressed entirely in black and wearing what appeared to be grinning skull masks. But what caught everyone's attention was the lightning bolts that were carved into the masks, one above the right eye and one above the left. "Allow me to introduce you all to Thunder and Lightning," Remus said softly as everyone crowded around the newspaper to see it. "The most prolific and dangerous criminals that Europe has seen in the last 50 years, at least." "My brothers are criminals?" Rose asked in horror as she looked at the picture. "Indeed," Remus replied with a sad nod. "Art thieves, to be precise. Responsible for several high-value robberies over the years. This picture was taken 3 days ago when the pair stole Eugene Delacroix's Leading the People painting. It's caused them to jump to number 1 on Interpol's most wanted list." Dumbledore's mind reeled as he listened to Remus talk about the two that most needed to be found. How could two 14-year-old boys possibly be so notorious? Lily's eyes suddenly rolled back into her head, and she swiftly collapsed. James barely managed to catch his wife before she hit the floor, and as he held her, he couldn't help but choke back a sob as he realized how badly he had failed as a father to his two sons. "How are you sure these two criminals are Marcus and Harry Potter?" Molly Weasley asked. "You can't see their faces, after all." "I know they're sent," Remus replied, turning to her. "I've been tracking it for over 6 years. So I'd know it better than anyone." "Do you know where they are now?" James asked desperately. "Please, Remus, if you know, you must tell us." "Indeed," Dumbledore replied. "The fate of our world depends on it. I don't give a toss about the magical world." Remus growled, shocking everyone into silence. "The magical world is what caused my pups to be forgotten while you all waited on Rose, hand and foot. The magical world is the reason why I can't hold a job, nor ever will, I imagine." Several heads dipped in guilt and shame at that, but Remus just kept on with his tirade. "The only thing I care about is whether or not my pups are happy and safe. You call letting two teenage boys run around robbing whoever they please safe?" Sirius demanded. "They're criminals." "Yes, they are," Remus snapped back. "And whose fault is that? Weren't you supposed to be Harry's godfather?" "Oh, that's right. You traded up when James asked you to be Rose's godfather instead." Sirius's face took on a milky color as he looked away in shame, unable to deny the truth of Remus' words. Casting one last sneer at Sirius, Remus turned back to Dumbledore. I will bring them here. Not for you and not for the magical world, but for them. To make sure that they are kept safe. But if you try and use them again like you used Rose, I will gut you, old man, got me. Dumbledore could only nod at the angry werewolf before him, unable to say anything after the verbal beatdown that Remus had bestowed on everyone. How long will it take to find them and bring them here? Rose asked softly, causing Remus to turn to her. Shouldn't take me too long to track them now that I have a fresh scent, Remus replied. I'll return when I have them. Turning to leave, Remus as stopped by Dumbledore's hand on his shoulder. Perhaps you should take some of the order with you, just to be safe. I can handle myself, thank you, Remus growled, shaking off Dumbledore's hand, and out of everyone here. I'm the least likely to be physically attacked when the boys see me. Nodding his head sadly, Dumbledore motioned that he understood, and Remus strode away. A moment later, the group heard the sound of the front door opening and closing, leaving behind a quiet and subdued order to continue their meeting. It's almost too easy, isn't it, Marcus? Harry asked as he enjoyed his basket of fries, across from him. His brother Marcus likewise enjoyed his salad as the two boys stared at the museum across from them. Hanging from the entrance was a large poster that told Anion, interested that the painting, Salvator Mundi, by Leonardo da Vinci would be a guest of the museum for the next month. I doubt it's as easy as they're making it, little brother, Marcus replied with a wink. You're like 20 minutes older than me, Harry retorted back angrily, as he always did when Marcus taunted him. Even a fool could see that the two boys were twins. They looked identical. Right down to their cheeky grins and constantly tapping feet. Both boys shared their father's messy black hair and their mother's glowing green eyes. The only difference was their appearance. Marcus as dressed in an expensive-looking Italian suit that was as black as his hair, which contrasted sharply with his blood-red shirt. His shoulder-length hair was tied back at the base of his skull. Harry wore a cream-colored short-sleeve dress shirt and a pair of black dress pants. Unlike his brother, Harry kept his hair short to avoid getting it caught in anything while on a job. He also thought it looked kind of girly and would constantly tease Marcus about it. Still counts. Marcus laughed back, taking one of Harry's fries, throwing it into the air, and catching it in his mouth. Still can't believe it, Harry hissed back excitedly. Number one most wanted. Keep your voice down, Marcus hissed back, quickly looking around. You're gonna get us caught. What are they gonna do? Harry laughed. Throw us into jail. Did you forget that we can teleport? We'd be out of prison before the ink dried on the cop's report. Marcus shook his head in exasperation. He loved his twin, he really did. But Harry had a knack for acting without thinking, and on more than one occasion, it had cost them their hull on a job. So, we doing this? Harry asked warily. You know we don't have to. The EY we made from our last job will keep us afloat for a long time. It's not about the money, Harry, Marcus replied, it's about playing the game. Harry grinned back at his twin before putting on his sunglasses and standing up to leave. Then, let's go and play, shall we? Let's, Marcus replied with a grin of his own as he, too, stood to leave. The twins exited the restaurant and turned in to a corner into what appeared to be a dead-end alley, but a moment later, they were both gone. Author's note. Imagine Merida from Disney's Brave if you want to know what Rose looks like. Also, because it's one of my favorite anime. The twins' masks look like Ichigo's hollow mask from Bleach. Humanity. Summary. The war with Voldemort is all but lost. The Ministry is near collapse, and Those few still brave enough to continue the fight are forced into hiding. Desperate to end the bloodshed and finally end Voldemort's war, Dumbledore and the Order of the Phoenix decide to summon a hero from another dimension who will be able to defeat Voldemort once and for all. Instead, they get a warrior who has been raised his entire life as an emotionless weapon in the form of someone who has been dead a long time. Will the Order be able to help this boy who has been taught his whole life that he's just a weapon? And how will Voldemort and his Death Eaters react to a warrior whose vocabulary doesn't include the word mercy? Dumbledore sighed sadly as he stared at the wooden table before him. The dining room was filled almost to capacity with people who were likewise silent as they tried to process the day's bad news. Bad news seemed to be all there was lately, and each day, the Order of the Phoenix held their breath as they awaited the newest list of victims left behind by Voldemort and his Death Eaters. The latest piece of horror, though, had been especially hard to bear as Voldemort had decided to make an example of Dumbledore and his order for their continued resistance, 2 days prior. During a regularly scheduled Hogsmeade weekend, Voldemort had unleashed his forces on the unsuspecting village. The end result was still being tallied, but it was suspected that at least 12 children and villagers had been mercilessly slaughtered. What hit even worse was when one of the Death Eaters had thrown off his mask to reveal the sneering face of Severus Snape. Snape, it was thought, was the Order's greatest weapon. He was their spy in Voldemort's ranks, and on more than one occasion, Snape's warnings had saved innocents that would have otherwise died. While a genuinely unpleasant individual, Snape was respected by all for putting his life on the line in order to let Dumbledore know what Voldemort was planning. What no one knew, save for a few individuals, was the reason Snape had volunteered to become a spy was due to him believing he owed a debt to his oldest friend. Back when he was still a loyal Death Eater, Snape had overheard a prophecy between Dumbledore and a seer named Sybil Trelawney, in which it was foretold that Voldemort's reign would soon come to an end and that the one responsible for said defeat would soon be born. Snape, eager to reap the rewards for such news, had immediately run to his master to tell him what Snape had heard. It was only when Snape learned that the chosen one was, in fact, the child of his oldest friend, Lily Potter, that Snape realized that he had inadvertently put his friend directly in the line of fire of Voldemort. Though Snape changed sides and became a spy, the damage had been done, and the child of Lily and James Potter had been killed. Along with James Potter's parents, who had been watching the child while Lily and James attended an Order meeting. All trace of friendship immediately vanished between Lily Potter and Severus Snape. As the former saw the latter as responsible for the death of their child, Snape learned this lesson well after trying to approach Lily to apologize for his part in the death of her son, only to become a guest of St. Mungo's soon after as a result. Snape had become an entirely different man after the attack by Lily. He rarely spoke unless directly asked occasionally, and seemed far more subdued than he had before, never once giving the suspicion that he was not totally loyal to Dumbledore and the destruction of Voldemort. That was why it was such a hard blow when Snape at last decided to show his true colors during what was quickly becoming known as the Hogsmeade Massacre. "What are we going to do now?" Mad-Eye Moody asked from where he was leaning against the far wall. "We're well and truly buggered now." "How do you figure that?" one of the Order, a witch with bright blonde hair, asked. "That bastard Snape knows the name of every member of the Order," Moody growled. "And even those whose homes lay behind wards are in danger of having their family kidnapped or tortured by the Dark Lord and his ilk. So might as well face it, boys and girls, it's over." "So that's it?" Sirius Black asked. "You're just going to give up?" "Never figured you for a coward, Moody." "Watch what you say, boy," Moody growled as he took a threatening step forward. "I've been fighting dark wizards and witches since you were still a swimmer in your father's pants, and you know what all those years of fighting have taught me." "What?" Sirius sneered back. "When to fight and when to run." Moody replied softly. "We have barely 30 fighters left. The Ministry is damn near ready for collapse thanks to the incompetence of Fudge, and Voldemort has us outnumbered at least 5 to 1. So, tell me, Lord Black, how do you plan to win what even a blind man can see is a lost cause?" "I don't know," Sirius retorted as he jumped angrily to his feet, "but it's better to fight than to just roll over and become Voldemort's bitch." "Hey, I'm all about noble death," James Potter replied with a wry laugh. "Pointless noble death, however." "So even you are ready to give up, Prongs?" Sirius asked in astonishment, "after what he did to Harry and your parents?" A dark look came across James Potter's face, which made those near him shift uneasily away. Even Sirius seemed afraid that he had gone too far. It had been nearly 15 years since the death of James's son and parents, and yet James and Lily still felt the pain of their deaths as though it were yesterday. Here is nothing I want more in this world than to see Voldemort die by my hand for what he has taken from me," James said, anger evident in every word. Beside him, Lily nodded in agreement. "But I will not risk the lives of my wife and children to achieve that result." "I'm sorry, Padfoot," So, that's it? Sirius demanded as he looked around the room. Many seemed unable to meet his eyes. You're L going to just leave England and let Voldemort have it? Let him enslave every Muggle born and kill those he has no use for? Sirius, we can't win this war, surely you can see that. Daedalus Diggle replied sadly, the enemy is too strong. We've lost over a dozen of our comrades in the last week alone, and unlike the Dark Lord, we cannot replace those losses. So what? Sirius snarled, this is our homeland we're talking about. And I, for one, will stand and fight for it. Here, several Order members cried though they were outnumbered by those who remained silent. Then you'll die, Moody sneered. Along with everyone who follows you. And the end result will be the same. You'll all die for nothing. Before Sirius could snarl back a retort, Dumbledore suddenly lifted his head and spoke in a weary voice. There is another option. Another option. James and Lily asked as one, what other option? Long ago, when I was a younger man, I found myself in Egypt, investigating the mysteries that might have been left there from a time long ago when magic was much stronger in our world than it is now. Luck seemed to be with me. For several months after arriving, I discovered what appeared to be a long-forgotten tomb. Dumbledore's eyes misted over as he lost himself in the memory. Inside, I found a great many wonders that I ensured made their way to responsible hands for further investigation and study. But the most wondrous thing I found in that tomb was a scroll that I immediately hid away once I realized what it did. What did it do? Remus Lupin asked. It contains instructions on how to perform a ritual that would allow a person to summon a hero from another dimension to fight on their behalf. However, the scroll emphasized that this ritual should only be used as a last resort, as the ritual is a one-way trip. So, anyone we summon, Lily asked in growing horror, would be stuck here. Precisely, Dumbledore concluded solemnly, which is why this decision should not be made lightly. We'd be essentially kidnapping someone from their home. Remus cried aghast, how can any of us even consider it? Needs must, Sirius replied, though even he looked pain. At the thought of actually following through with such a ritual. If this ritual summons a hero who will finally rid us of Voldemort, then I say let's do it. The next few hours were spent in deliberation as the Order argued the pros and cons of going through with the ritual. It was only after several hours of argument that it was finally agreed upon that the ritual must be performed as as simply no other way that anyone could see. Harry Potter stood at parade rest in front of his bunk as he awaited his commander to arrive and debrief him on Harry's previous mission. The minutes continued to tick by. And yet Harry didn't move a muscle as he waited. Like every other soldier in the magical military, Harry was clean-shaven, with a military haircut. He used to wear glasses, but his eyes had been corrected when he was 7. He was dressed in a pair of black camo, multi-pocket cargo pants, a pair of black military boots, and a black muscle shirt. Despite barely turning 16, Harry's arms were littered with scars. And many more lay hidden beneath his clothes from past battles. His wand was strapped to his right wrist, as was the norm, and his 1911 pistol was securely on his hip. Like all children, Harry had been taken from his parents at 5 years old and placed into the magical military program when it was discovered that Harry had magic, as all those who could perform magic automatically became the state's property upon discovery. He would unfortunately not see his parents again for 5 long years, and those next few years of Harry's life were pure hell. There was no other way to adequately describe it. The instructors pushed the recruits to the very edge of their physical and mental limits, and those who couldn't overcome those limits were quickly put down, lest they infect the other recruits with their weakness. Discipline was paramount in the magical military, and harsh punishments were handed down to those who defied the trainers. Whipping was a common punishment, though there were harsher ones, depending on the severity of the crime. It was quite normal for a group of over 100 to be whittled down to barely a few dozen by the end due to their horrifying training methods. All trace of individuality was quickly snuffed out as the trainees were taught that their only concern was the protection of the state. Foolish notions like mercy and forgiveness were also beaten out of them to ensure that they became the perfect soldiers for the state. Even though their names were taken from them upon entering the program, Harry became number 6101. 3 and would remain so until he either died or graduated and was thus allowed to have his name back. But Harry overcame everything that was thrown at him and, upon finishing his training, quickly became known as a being of pure destruction and death on the battlefield, something that had made his father, Colonel James Potter, quite proud. Unfortunately, James Potter and his second-in-command, Sirius Black, had both been killed last year in a suicide attack by rebels. Harry was sure that his mother would have been proud of him as well had she not been killed in battle a few years after Harry had been taken into the program. Despite his young age, Harry quickly gained fame for his ruthlessness and sharp tactical mind, earning the nickname Reaper, due to how destructive he was in battle, leaving few survivors. As Harry waited for his commander, he noticed a strange blue light begin to surround him in a way that immediately made him wary. Was this some new type of magic that the Unspeakables had decided to test? Was Harry to be the test subject? His instincts screamed at him to run, that he was in danger, but the discipline that had been beaten into him since childhood held him in place. If he had been chosen to be the test subject for a new branch of magic, then so be it. After all, it was the duty of every soldier in the magical military to willingly give their lives for the state if needed. Slowly closing his eyes, Harry waited for whatever was about to happen. A moment later, he felt as though someone had set him on fire, and he quickly bit down on his tongue to keep from screaming, never once leaving parade rest. He had the vague feeling that he was falling and was tempted to open his eyes, but the agony he was in made such a small thing impossible as all of Harry's concentration was on trying not to scream and thus dishonoring himself. A moment later, the feeling stopped, and the pain vanished as quickly as it had come, as Harry took slow breaths and tried to calm himself. He could hear gasps and whispers echoing around him, followed by someone exclaiming, "Blimey, it worked!" Someone shouted in what sounded like awe, "It's a kid. How the bloody hell is a kid supposed to help us?" Another voice asked, "Maybe the ritual failed." A third voice added. Not recognizing the voices, Harry's eyes immediately snapped open, causing even more gasps and whispering. He was standing in what appeared to be a basement and was currently surrounded by what looked like several dozen people, all of whom were wearing robes with the hood up to hide who they were. Immediately, Harry's training took over, and he dove to his left, ripping his pistol and wand from their holsters. Harry didn't know where he was and was currently surrounded by strangers whose intentions were unknown. Furthermore, he had not been notified of any new training programs, if that was indeed what this was. Unwilling to be taken by surprise, Harry rolled and came to his feet, firing a round from his pistol as he did so. To Harry's surprise, rather than his shot killing its target, his shot went wide and hit its victim in the shoulder, causing the robed figure to spin and hit the floor with a curse. "I missed," Harry thought in surprise as he dove behind some wooden boxes as cover. "I never miss." Before Harry could think on the matter further, the basement lit up as the robed figures fired a dozen different spells and curses at the boxes that Harry was currently hiding behind. As the spells began to tear his cover to pieces, Harry growled in annoyance. It wasn't the first time he had been outgunned and outnumbered with little information on how it had come about, but one thing was always universally the same about said encounters: Harry always ended up being the one left alive at the end. "Stop," an elderly voice called out. "We need him to help us, not see us as enemies." So they wanted him alive, did they? That made his job easy as he had no such weakness for his enemies. Rising from his hiding spot, Harry aimed his wand at the closest robed figure. "Confringo," Harry said in his monotone voice, watching with disinterest as the blasting curse flew straight toward its target, just before it struck. Another of the robed figures cried out in a shrill voice, "Avis!" Instantly, a flock of birds flew out of the figure's wand between Harry's target and his spell. A moment later, the spell struck the birds, causing a small explosion that blanked the basement in smoke and feathers. A single twitch of the eyebrow was the only evidence that Harry was frustrated with his failure to kill his opponent. Staring through the smoke at where his opponent had been a moment ago, Harry began to move from his cover, not wanting to be where his enemies thought he was. Straining his eyes through the smoke, Harry saw one of the robed figures with their back to him. Knowing the value of a hostage, Harry quickly holstered his pistol, stormed forward, and wrapped his arm around the neck of the robed figure. Pressing his wand into the figure's neck, "Make a sound, and you'll die before they can reach you," Harry said in a cold voice that made Harry's hostage stiffen with alarm. "Please," the voice replied, And Harry realized that his hostage was a woman. "We mean you no harm. This is all just a big misunderstanding." "Irrelevant," Harry replied in the same cold voice, "Till I gain further information on my current situation, you are my hostage. Failure to obey my orders will result in your immediate termination. Do you understand?" The woman merely gulped in fear as a reply, causing Harry to shake his head in disgust at her apparent weakness. Suddenly, the smoke dissipated, and Harry glared angrily as he saw that he was completely surrounded by more than 24 robed figures, all of whom were currently pointing their wands at Harry. "Release my wife," one of the robed figures snarled, taking a step forward before another figure placed a calming hand on his arm. "Peace, James. We did not come here to fight. Tell that to him." The figure that Harry had shot earlier retorted as blood ran down his arm. As Harry heard the voice, he twitched in recognition. "You should have ducked, Sirius," another robed figure replied. "Really?" The shot one, Sirius apparently, retorted. "You want to make jokes, now? Remove your hoods, all of you, right now," Harry ordered, pressing his wand into the woman's throat, "or this one dies first. You touch a hair on her head, and I'll bury you." The robed figure that Harry strongly suspected was her husband spat. "The hoods," Harry stated, showing how unintimidated by the man he was by pressing his wand deeper into the woman's neck and eliciting a groan of pain from her. "Now." Slowly, one of the robed figures stepped forward and lowered his hood. Were it not for the steel-like discipline that had been beaten into Harry, he would have dropped his wand in shock, for standing across from him was General Albus Dumbledore, the commanding officer of the British state, and Harry had attacked him. Granted, it could be a trick, and Harry's mind immediately came up with half a dozen ways in which his senses could have been fooled. "Do as he says," Dumbledore stated simply, "all of you." Slowly, the other robed figures began lowering their wands and taking off their hoods, causing Harry's discipline to be so tested as he saw ghosts surround him. There was Lieutenant Arthur Weasley, who had died 6 years prior. Standing next to him was his wife, Molly Weasley, who had been hanged after evidence had come out that she had been sending messages to the rebels for a year. Her reason for this was that she wanted her children to be free from the life she had been forced into. Unfortunately, her children had all disappeared soon after, and the rumor was that they had joined the rebels in retaliation for their mother's execution. More and more ghosts seemed to fill the basement as Harry saw faces that he had never expected to see again. But the one that shocked Harry the most was when James Potter removed his hood and glared at him. This shock was multiplied when Sirius Black removed his hood a moment later, likewise glaring at Harry. "You're his wife?" Harry asked his hostage. "I heard him call you his wife. What is your name?" "Answer me." "Lily," the woman answered quickly. "My name is Lily Potter." "Impossible," Harry whispered, slowly unwrapping his arm from around her neck and turning her so that she was facing him. Pressing his wand into her stomach, Harry slowly began pulling down her hood to reveal a face that Harry had only seen once but remembered in great detail. "Mother?" Harry asked, causing the woman to stiffen in front of him as she looked at him for the first time. He had her eyes. And as her own widened in shock, she suddenly realized why he seemed so familiar. "Harry?" Lily asked in shock. Though she had asked softly, her voice seemed to echo throughout the basement, causing a few of the order to gasp in shock. James and Sirius seemed to turn white as they heard Lily's words, and both took a step forward to get a better look at Harry. Only Dumbledore had managed to avoid having a physical reaction. Though inside, he was shocked to his core. Harry Potter was alive. True, it may not be their world's Harry Potter, but the fact that one had been summoned meant that the prophecy could hopefully still be enacted, and Voldemort could possibly be killed. As Dumbledore stared, he couldn't help but feel sorrow at how the Harry from this world never got the chance to grow up as this Harry had done. Though perhaps that was a good thing. The boy was tall and powerfully built, with scars trailing down his muscular arms. On his right bicep lay a tattoo of 2NDS crossed over a broadsword that was embedded into the skull of some type of creature. Over the top of the tattoo were the letters MMB. "Harry, is that you?" Lily asked again as she reached out to touch the boy, only to stop when Harry grabbed her wrist. "Who are you?" Harry asked in a cold voice that shocked Lily to her core. "You are not Capitan Lily Potter. She died in battle many years ago. You are not her, Capitan. Remus asked in bemusement. Since when did Lily join the military? Remus Lupin, Harry growled, bringing his attention to the werewolf, rebel leader and werewolf. Responsible for the death of Lieutenant Colonel Amelia Bones. Current bounty, 20,000 galleons, dead or alive. Shoving Lily aside, Harry aimed his wand at Remus, only for every wand in the room to be raised in the werewolf's defense. Even as Remus stared at Harry in complete shock. I have a bounty on my head. Remus asked in shock. I'm responsible for the murder of Amelia Bones. Indeed you do, Harry retorted in a monotone voice, unafraid even as 24 wands lit up dangerously, and if you think your friends will prevent me from collecting, then you underestimate me, a dangerous mistake to make. You so much as twitch, and it'll be the last thing you do, Sirius growled, I don't care how badly we need you. That's enough, Dumbledore snapped, finally losing his patience. At how badly this whole situation had gone. To the surprise of everyone, Harry suddenly snapped to attention. Yes, sir, Harry called out, making the others look at him in surprise, none more so than Dumbledore, who stared at Harry curiously. Now, let's begin with introductions, shall we? I take it you know me and a few others here. Yes, sir, Harry replied immediately, still at attention. You are General Albus Dumbledore, Commander-in-Chief of the magical armies of Britain, Ireland, and Scotland. I'm a general, Dumbledore asked in joyful surprise. How entertaining. Personally responsible for the death of the Dark Wizard, Gellert Grindelwald, Harry continued. Shortly afterward, you had all those who fought under Grindelwald executed as well. You have led the magical state for the last 60 years as we fight against the hated enemy. The enemy? Dumbledore asked, deeply disturbed by what his counterpart had done in Harry's world. Muggles, of course, sir, Harry stated simply, causing gasps. You are fighting against Muggles? Sirius demanded in horror. You're no better than Voldemort. This is supposed to be our hero. Why are you fighting against Muggles, Harry? Dumbledore asked softly. Muggles discovered that magic was real shortly after the end of World War II, Harry replied, and immediately attacked, seeing us as a threat. The war continues to this day, and all those with magical blood are expected to fight in it. We are taken from our families at 5 years old and placed into the magical military program. There, we are taught how to best serve the state in the war. Dear God, Molly said in horror as the others stared at Harry in shock. They take children from their families at 5 years old. That's far too young to be trained for war. Hat happens to the ones not strong enough. They die, sir, Harry stated simply, causing shock to echo throughout the room. There is no place for weakness in the state. The state, Lily said softly, sounds an awful lot like communism. Quote, I'm afraid I don't know what that is, ma'am, Harry replied, still at attention. May I ask where I am, ma'am? And why am I here? The Order of the Phoenix looked at each other for a moment, none of them knowing how to properly answer the question, when Sirius spoke, voicing what many were no doubt thinking. That's a long story, lad. Yes, sir, Harry replied automatically, causing a few to share looks of confusion about the boy's behavior when he was trying to kill them. All just moments ago. A few moments later, Harry had been informed as to why he had been summoned and the fact that he was now a permanent guest of this new dimension, which annoyed Harry a great deal though he was too disciplined to admit it. Permission to speak freely, sir? Harry asked Dumbledore, making the old man tilt his head in curiosity. Permission granted, Dumbledore said at once, and you may stand at ease, Mr. Potter. Shifting quickly into parade rest, Harry looked at Dumbledore silently for a moment before speaking again. If I am to understand my mission parameters correctly, sir, you want me to kill your resident Dark Lord and all who follow him. Is that correct, sir? Of course not, Dumbledore replied in horror. Everyone deserves a second chance, Harry. The only one that must be destroyed is Voldemort. He is too dangerous to be allowed to live any longer. I'm afraid I do not understand, sir, Harry replied, confusion evident on his face. You are fighting in a war, and the way to win a war is to kill your enemies, correct, sir? The lads got you there, Dumbledore. Moody laughed. Got much experience in battle, boy. Of course, he hasn't. Molly retorted. He's a child. No, ma'am, Harry replied, turning his head to face her. I Have not been a child for a very long time. I am a soldier, and my duty is to my commanding officer and to the state. Then, turning back to Moody, Harry continued, I am well trained for combat, sir. Hey, we'll see, Moody replied with a sneer. The ritual was supposed to bring forth a hero who would kill Voldemort. Is that you, boy? Harry's face went blank at that, and for a moment, Moody didn't think Harry would reply when suddenly the boy spoke in a voice as cold as ice and which caused even Moody to shiver in dread. When do we start, sir? The Iron Wizard. The Iron Wizard. Tony Stark, the genius billionaire playboy philanthropist, sat alone in his office, nursing his second glass of scotch. The reason for this night of self-induced drinking was due to a picture he had found earlier in the day in an old box. The picture was almost a decade old and showed Tony with a beautiful red-headed woman whom Tony never imagined seeing again. Her name had been Lily, and Tony had met her on a night at a bar in London after an important meeting with some incredibly boring investors. Afterward, Tony had made his way to the closest bar he could find to wash away the slimy feeling that the clients had given him. And there he had met Lily. Almost immediately, Tony had found an attraction with Lily. Unlike the other women that Tony had met in bars, Lily was brilliant and actually able to hold a conversation with Tony in ways that no other woman had been able to do, and the more the two talked, the more that Tony had felt drawn to her. After a few drinks, Lily told Tony that the reason she was at the bar drinking in the first place was that she had received the unfortunate news that she would never be a mother. Her husband had apparently been hurt at work, and as a result, had lost the ability to father children. Tony had jokingly offered to help with that, and to his surprise, Lily had actually considered the idea, telling him that she would return the following night with an answer if Tony was still willing to help. Tony had almost not shown up. The very idea of what Lily was suggesting boggled Tony's mind, and yet Tony couldn't get over the appeal that came with Lily's suggestion. Tony had no illusions about the kind of man he had been then. He was vain, arrogant, completely self-centered, and never really saw himself as a family man, so the idea of actually helping someone create a family without actually having to be a part of said family greatly appealed to him. When Tony returned to the bar the next night, he had met Lily's husband, James Potter, and loath though he was to admit it, Tony had found himself like Lily's husband. James was almost as immature as Tony was, and yet there was also an honorable man in James that Tony found himself liking. A few hours later, the three of them had come to an agreement. Tony would donate the necessary ingredients to ensure that Lily would be able to conceive, but after that, Tony would not be obligated to provide anything more for the child. Nor would Lily or James be able to sue Tony for any monetary assistance in raising the child thereafter. A week later, the deed was done, and Tony flew back to New York City, never thinking of seeing or thinking of Lily Potter again until he discovered the picture in an old box of forgotten things. Had it really been 8 years since that night? Much had changed since that night. At least for Tony anyway. Since that night, Tony had become almost an entirely different person. Barely a year ago, Tony had been abducted by terrorists and forced to witness how his company had become not the beacon of scientific advancement that his father had hoped for, but rather a company of death and destruction. Thankfully, Tony had managed to escape his captors and returned home with one objective: to change his company and make it into one that he could look back on one day with pride rather than disgust. Naturally, there had been those who objected to Tony's line of thought. And he had been forced to battle his longtime father figure Obadiah Stane. It had been Obadiah who had sold Tony out to the terrorists who had captured him, all in the hope that they would kill Tony, thus allowing Obadiah to take control of Tony's company. Tony had used his new Iron Man armor to fight Obadiah and had thankfully come out the victor. Since then, Tony has become the superhero, Iron Man, and his singular purpose has been to make the world safer and repair the reputation his company had unfortunately gotten due to his own inadequacies. Now, Tony wondered what had become of Lily and the child he had given her 8 years ago. Was it a boy or a girl? How had they been raised? Where were they now? Tony would never have asked any of these questions 8 years ago, but now, Tony had a burning need to find the answers to these questions, to discover what had become of the only piece of his family he had left. Jarvis, Tony called out before taking another deep drink from his glass. Enjoying the way the scotch burned down his throat. "Yes, sir," came the voice of Tony's AI. "How can I be of service, sir?" "I need you to find any and all information on Lily and James Potter, including their current location." "Understood, sir." "Can you provide any other information that will limit my search?" "All I know is that I met them in London, England, 8 years ago," Tony replied wearily. "I will begin my search immediately, sir." As the office again descended into silence, Tony's mind began to whirl with what-ifs, starting with what he would do when he found Lily again. Little Harry Potter groaned as the bristles of the weeds he was pulling stabbed his fingers for what seemed the 5th time in less than 20 minutes. As per usual, Harry had been sent out into the hot sun to tend to his Aunt Petunia's garden, while his cousin Dudley lounged inside the cool house watching television. Though Harry was 8 years old, the extra-large clothes that draped over his body, combined with the malnutrition he had experienced since living with his relatives, made the poor boy look far younger. As the sun beat down on Harry's back, he wearily wiped the sweat from his forehead before reaching for another weed, already wincing at the pain he knew was coming due to his aunt forgetting to give him gloves as per usual. Harry had been with his Aunt Petunia and Uncle Vernon Dursley for 7 years, ever since his parents had died in a car accident, according to his Aunt Petunia, but that was all Harry knew about his mum and dad, as his aunt and uncle refused to say anything more about them, and would become very angry with Harry if he asked any questions regarding them. They never beat Harry, thankfully, but what they did do somehow seemed worse. They treated poor Harry as though he was scum or some kind of ticking time bomb that might go off at any moment. When he was younger, Harry tried to do nice things for his aunt and uncle, but Harry was met with disgust and loathing rather than love whenever he did. Once, when Harry was 5, he had made a beautiful Mother's Day card for his aunt, only to watch with his eyes filled with tears as Petunia ripped it to pieces in front of him. "You are not my son," Petunia had screeched. "I would never have birthed something as unnatural as you." Harry had learned well from this lesson and did not try again. He didn't know why his aunt and uncle hated him so much, but it was evident to Harry from a very young age that they despised Harry for some reason. It wasn't that Harry wanted to be unnatural. It was just that strange things seemed to happen to Harry, whether he wanted them to or not. Once, when Harry had first started kindergarten, Harry was being chased by his cousin Dudley during recess. Just as Dudley and his gang were about to catch up to him, Harry suddenly appeared high in a nearby tree, safely out of Dudley's reach. As a result, the teacher had been forced to call the fire department, and Harry spent the next week locked in his cupboard as punishment, receiving only stale bread and water. Another time, Harry had once again found himself being chased by Dudley, only or his fat cousin to suddenly break out in boils that caused him to shriek in agony. Harry had once again been blamed for it, and it was one of the few times that his Uncle Vernon had taken the belt to Harry, not stopping the beating until Harry had passed out from the pain. All Harry truly wanted was for someone to take him away from his hated relatives and to give him the kind of family that the other children at his school seemed to have. Harry had often found himself watching hungrily as the other parents hugged and kissed their children, while Harry was forced into the car by his Aunt Petunia without so much as a pat on the shoulder. Yet as the years went by, Harry was forced to acknowledge that he was alone, that no one would ever want him, and that whether he liked it or not, the Dursleys were all he had. Another reason for Harry's bitterness towards his relatives was due to them forcing Harry to hide his amazing intellect, as they didn't want their freak of a nephew to outshine their precious Dudley. Harry, though only 8 years old, truly had a mind that should have been marveled at, and yet he was forced to keep his grades low or face his Uncle Vernon's wrath, as he had when he had first entered school and showed how brilliant he was. The teachers had actually wanted to jump Harry ahead due to his intelligence, but that idea was quickly squashed when his aunt and uncle had flat out refused to consent. Since then, Harry had learned the rules and followed them to the letter. Keep his head down, never ask for help because no one ever would, and do whatever he had to keep out of his relatives' way. As Harry began to pull the weeds again, he couldn't help the feeling that something was going to happen, something big. Ordinarily, Harry would just ignore these feelings, as he had learned long ago that to hope for escape from the Dursleys would only make it harder when that hope was crushed. Yet, The feeling remained all the same, as though someone was softly whispering in his ear. "Don't worry, Harry, soon you'll be free of them." A week later, Tony was just finishing the improvements to his new arm cannon when Jarvis called out to him. "Sir, I have the I.N. formation you requested about Lily and James Potter." Instantly, Tony forgot all about the cannon and turned to the image Jarvis had projected, showing a picture of a very young Lily Potter standing next to what appeared to be her parents and a rather paling-looking teenager. Well, as he stared at the picture, Tony demanded, "What have you found out?" Lily Evans was born January 30, 1980, to Robert and Margaret Evans, the younger sister of one Petunia Evans, now Petunia Dursley. The couple were remarkable in their own right, working as doctors until their death in 1997. Cause of death? Tony asked immediately. "The death certificate says it was a car accident, sir," Jarvis replied. "Okay," Tony nodded. "Continue." As remarkable as Ms. Evans' parents were, their youngest far outstretched them. According to her school reports, which showed that even at a young age, she was undoubtedly brilliant. However, all records regarding Lily Evans's education suddenly stop at age 11. "Stop?" Tony asked in confusion. "What do you mean stop?" "I have searched every record I can find, sir," Jarvis replied, "but there is no record of Lily Evans attending any type of schooling after 1991. Now that's interesting," Tony said thoughtfully as he rubbed his hand under his chin. "What about James Potter?" "I have been unable to find any information about James Potter other than the fact that he was the heir of a noble house of lords, a duke to be precise." "Was?" Tony asked, his blood going cold. "Indeed, sir," Jarvis replied. "According to my research, both Lily and James Potter died in a sudden gas explosion at their home in Godric's Hollow on October 31, 2001. "Died?" Tony asked in a shaky voice. "They're dead." "Yes, sir," Jarvis replied. "What about children?" Tony demanded at once. "Did they have any children?" "Yes, sir. According to my research, Lily and James Potter had one child, a boy named Harry Potter." "What happened to the boy?" Tony asked, relief flowing through him at the thought that his child might still be alive despite his parents' unfortunate death. "He is currently in the custody of his Aunt Petunia and her husband, Vernon Dursley." "Any information on the boy?" "Yes, sir. According to my research, Harry started his education with top marks. However, he has since fallen to an abysmal level, barely passing his classes, in fact." "Show me," Tony said at once, sensing that something was off with the information. As Jarvis pulled up the requested data, Tony saw that his AI was correct. Harry's grades were atrocious, and yet they had been head and shoulders above that of his peers. Sensing that something was indeed wrong, Tony decided to follow his train of thought. "Jarvis, show me the grades of Harry's cousin. Give me a side-by-side." "Yes, sir," Jarvis replied before bringing up the requested data. As Tony's eyes roamed the report cards, he saw that his suspicion was correct. Harry's grades had at one time far surpassed that of his cousin. But after a few months of this, Harry's grades began to decline until his cousin's easily beat Harry's. "He's being forced to hide his intellect," Tony thought angrily. "My son is being forced to hide how smart he is." Quote. The thought brought a wave of anger to Tony that he didn't think he was possible of having, and as he read more about Harry's aunt and uncle, a creeping thought began to worm itself into his gut. If Harry was being punished for being smart, then what else were the Dursleys doing to his son? A sudden black rage swept through Tony at the thought, and he suddenly realized that he was moving toward the door. "Jarvis, notify Happy that I want the jet fueled and ready to go in an hour." "Yes, sir, and where will you be going?" "London, England," Tony responded immediately, "to collect my son." "Your son, sir," Jarvis replied. "I was unaware that you had a son, sir." "It's complicated," Tony admitted sheepishly, "but I'll explain it all on the jet. For now, I want you to get me all the information you can on Petunia and Vernon Dursley. Also, notify my London property that I'm coming. I want the building ready when I arrive." "At once, sir," Jarvis replied before signing off as Tony quickly made his way to his bedroom and began to speed pack. He had just about finished when his assistant girlfriend, Pepper Potts, strode into his room wearing a frown. And just where do you think you're going? Pepper asked with a raised brow. London, Tony stated simply, causing Pepper's mouth to drop slightly. London, Pepper repeated. Why on earth would you be going to London? Did you forget that you have a meeting with Nakatomi Corporation tomorrow? They can reschedule their damn meeting. Tony retorted. This is more important. Tony, this is a multi-million-dollar deal. Pepper thundered back. What could be more important? My son. Tony all but shouted back, causing Pepper to go pale instantly. Your son? Pepper asked in a shocked voice. Since when do you have a son? Who's the mother? Her name was Lily, Tony answered sadly, and Pepper felt the anger drain out of her at the word, was, and she was a brilliant woman that I met 8 years ago. She and her husband couldn't have children on their own, so I volunteered to help them out. It was a spur-of-the-moment decision, but I honestly don't regret it. What happened to her? Pepper asked in a small voice. She and her husband died 7 years ago, Tony replied sadly, and I have reason to believe that my son is being abused by the ones that are supposed to be raising him. So, I'm going to bring him home. You mean we're going to bring him home? Pepper responded hotly, causing Tony to freeze in surprise. You mean? Tony began before he was cut off. Yes, Tony, Pepper thundered hotly. If this child is indeed yours and indeed is being abused, then I am going with you, and we're going to bring him home with us. God, I love you, Pepper, Tony said sincerely, bringing a smile to the woman's face. I know, Pepper said with a wink, causing Tony to grin at her. Now, let's get on the road. It's a long way to England, and we'll need to know everything we can about. What's his name? Harry, Tony said with a smile, which was mirrored a moment later by Pepper. Harry, that's a good name, Pepper replied softly. Anyway, as I was saying, we need to know everything we can about Harry and his guardians before we land to ensure we are to retrieve the boy. You don't need to come, you know, Tony replied quickly, earning a glare from Pepper. Nonsense. We both know you'd be lost without me. Now, hurry up. Without another word, Pepper spun on her heel and stalked out of the room. A moment later, a grinning Tony followed behind her. 14 hours later, Tony sat with Pepper as their car pulled up to number 4, Privet Drive. Tony had wanted to march on the Dursleys' home after what he had discovered about the family and their treatment of his son. But Pepper had managed to convince the man that he needed a good night's rest before making any decisions regarding the Dursleys and especially regarding Harry. According to Jarvis, research, Vernon Dursley was the director of a drill-making company called Grunnings. Tony had immediately bought the company and was looking forward to the man's face when he discovered that he would soon be out of a job. As they pulled up to the boring-looking house, which seemed to be a clone of every other boring-looking home in this neighborhood, Tony's eyes were immediately drawn to a small, black-haired boy who appeared to be watering the lawn. Is that Harry? Pepper asked softly as she gazed sadly at the boy. He seemed far too skinny, which was made worse by the extremely oversized clothes the boy was wearing. The only other physical feature that Pepper could see was the glasses that the boy was wearing, which seemed to be held together by a lot of Scotch tape. I think so, Tony replied in a dazed voice as he saw his son for the first time. My God, he's so tiny. He's supposed to be 8 years old. That child looks like he's no older than 6. What the hell have those monsters done to my son? Tony, calm down, Pepper ordered, placing a calm hand over his. I don't like it any better than you do, but you're no good to Harry if you're too angry to think straight. After an inhuman amount of effort, Tony finally managed to get his breathing and temper under control and nodded to Pepper that he was ready. A moment later, the two stepped out of the car and approached the small boy, who turned to them with a worried expression on his face. Can I help you? Harry asked in a soft voice that made Pepper smile slightly. Yes, we're looking for someone named Harry Potter. Does he live here? Yes, ma'am, Harry replied warily. I'm Harry. Tony and Pepper both smiled as one, and Harry felt himself relaxing slightly as he beheld them. Something about them told Harry to trust them. Well, Harry, Tony said warmly, my name is Tony Stark, and I would like to speak with your relatives if that's all right. My aunt and uncle don't like salesmen, Harry replied softly, biting his lip. If you're selling something, they won't wanna listen. That's all right, Harry, Tony said with a wink. I guarantee that they'll want to listen to what I have to say. Biting his lip in indecision, Harry decided to listen to the voice that was telling him to trust the two adults. Okay, follow me, then, Harry replied softly before turning and walking into the house, followed quickly by Tony and Pepper. Brat, what are you doing in the house? A loud voice yelled. That yard better be watered, or you'll be locked in the cupboard for a week. At the mention of the cupboard, Tony's eyes were immediately drawn to the cupboard under the stairs, and his eyes narrowed as he saw the many locks on the outside of it. As Harry began to shake with fright, Pepper wrapped a protective arm around the boy as a large man walked out of the living room and into the hallway, stopping with surprise as he took in the two new people in his house. Who the devil are you? Vernon asked as Tony sized him up. Vernon was a corpulent man with a large mustache, and instantly Tony had to suppress a laugh as he imagined a walrus wearing clothes. My name is Tony Stark, Mr. Dursley, Tony said in a controlled voice. And I am here to speak to you about my son. Your son? Vernon replied in confusion. I don't even know your son. You should know him. Tony growled back. After all, you've just threatened to lock him in a cupboard for a week. By the end, Tony's voice had gone deathly cold, and even Vernon had stepped back in fear before he registered what Tony had just said. As Vernon sputtered in anger, Harry felt as though the floor had dropped out from under his feet, and he found himself clinging to Pepper's leg as though she would disappear. Why, you're my daddy? Harry asked in a shocked voice, causing Tony to turn and look down at the scared boy with a warm smile. That's right, kiddo, Tony said softly, bending down onto one knee to face Harry, and I've come to take you home with me if you want to. Slowly, Harry looked up at Pepper with tears begging to pool in his eyes. Are you my mummy? No, sweetie, Pepper replied softly. I wish I could say yes, but I'm not. But I can be your friend if you like. I've never had a friend before, Harry mumbled, causing Tony and Pepper to share an angry look before Pepper replied in a soft voice. Well, you have one now, Harry. If you'd like me to be, that is. Yes, please, Harry said enthusiastically, making both Tony and Pepper smile again at him. Vernon, by this point, had turned incandescent with rage at being ignored in his own house. Now, see here, I will not be ignored in my own home. And if you're that little freak's father, then where have you been all this time? Instantly, Tony rose back to his feet and rushed across the room so that it appeared as though he had vanished and reappeared inches from Vernon's face, causing Harry's uncle to freeze in sudden fear as Tony glared at him. Don't call my son a freak, Tony snarled, and I only discovered that my son existed yesterday. Otherwise, I would have taken him from you much sooner. Well, you can't have him. Vernon snarled back, regaining his confidence. He belongs to me. He is not property, you fat pig. Pepper all but shouted as Harry tried to hide behind her legs. If you wanted him, you should have come for him before I was forced to spend 7 years' worth of my hard-earned money on him. Vernon snarled. If you want him, then I demand recompense. This seemed to be the last straw for Tony, who promptly slammed his fist into Vernon's jaw, spinning the fat man completely around before he fell onto the floor with a shattering crash. I am not paying you for my own son, Tony roared at the downed man. Tony, Pepper yelled, you're scaring Harry. Tony turned at that and saw that. Indeed, Harry looked frightened and seemed to try not to cry as he hid behind Pepper's legs. Slowly, approaching, so as to not startle him more, Tony kneeled down and smiled at his son. Hey, kiddo, I'm sorry I scared you. Do you want to come out? I promise I won't hurt you. Pinky promise? Harry asked as he slowly held out his pinky at Tony, who laughed at the action. Pinky promise, Tony replied, wrapping his finger around Harry's pinky, making the boy giggle before he slowly came out, shuffling nervously as Tony stared at him. Are you going to take me away from here? Harry asked, desperation evident in his tone. You bet, kiddo, Tony replied warmly, and I promise that you'll never come back here again. It was all too much for Harry, and he jumped into Tony's arms before beginning to sob as Tony gently rubbed his back. It's okay, Harry, Tony said softly, trying not to cry himself, Dad's here now. Pepper was unable to hold back the tears and watched happily as they ran down her cheeks. He's not going anywhere. Do you hear me? Vernon snarled as he rose to his feet, rubbing his jaw with a wince. You struck me. I'll see you in prison for that. Not likely, Tony sneered. I've got better lawyers than you, Dursley. It's the reason why I was able to buy Grunnings before landing in England. Vernon's face paled at the news that he was standing in front of his new boss and had yelled and cursed at him, something that made Tony smile as he continued speaking at the now pale and shaking Vernon. So, let's talk about what's going to happen here. Dursley, you are going to sign over any and all rights that you currently have over my son. Yes, sir, Vernon growled through gritted teeth. Then, Tony continued as though Vernon hadn't spoken. You are going to leave my company. I don't care where you go, but you will no longer be working for Grunnings. What? Vernon cried in alarm. You can't do that. They've been working for Grunnings for 20 years. And now you're not. Tony smirked. Funny how that works, huh? You can't do this. I'll sue. You're more than welcome to do that, Tony smirked, but if you do, you'll lose. And when you do, I'll respond tenfold. And I won't stop until I've taken everything you have. So, do you really want to play this game, fat boy? Daddy, don't, Harry whimpered. When Uncle Vernon gets mad, he gets really scary. He'll hurt you. Don't worry, kid, Tony said with a grin. Your daddy isn't scared of him, and I'm stronger than I look. Tony's expression hardened as he turned back to Vernon, who had actually turned purple with rage. Well, Tony asked, what's your answer? For a moment, Vernon looked as though he wanted to attack Tony, but just as quickly, the thought left Vernon. And the man seemed to deflate before muttering angrily. What do you need me to sign? Pepper, Tony called with a grin, causing his girlfriend to reach into her bag and pull out some papers, which she quickly handed over to Tony, who in turn handed them to Vernon. Sign where it says to sign, and we'll be on our way, which I think will be best for all of us. Let's just get this over with. Vernon growled. My wife will be home soon with my son, and I'd rather the brat be gone before she returns. Call my son a brat again, and she'll come home to find you unconscious, Tony growled, causing Vernon to visibly gulp before hurrying into the dining room to sign the paperwork. As Vernon began to sign furiously, Harry gently tugged on Tony's pants leg, causing him to turn to the boy. Daddy, are we leaving here soon? Just as soon as the paperwork is done, kiddo, Tony replied happily. Can I get my dear? Harry asked softly. It's the only thing I have left from Mummy. Sure, Harry, Tony replied softly. Where is it? In my room, Harry replied as he stared at his feet. Where's your room, Harry? Pepper asked, coming to stand next to Tony, rather than answer. Harry simply sniffled and pointed at the cupboard, making Tony and Pepper share a look of shock before Tony asked in a controlled voice. Harry, are you saying that your aunt and uncle make you sleep in there? Yes, sir, Harry mumbled as he wrung his shirt worriedly in his hands. For how long? Pepper asked. I've always been there, Harry replied with another sniffle. That son of a, Tony, language, Pepper admonished immediately before Tony could finish, though even she looked ready to tear Vernon apart. Gritting his teeth, Tony strode to the cupboard and ripped it open. The inside was dark, and it took a moment for Tony's eyes to adjust. When they had, Tony saw that there was barely enough room to move and only a small army cot sat in the dark cupboard, upon which lay an old battered stag plushie. Fighting back the anger that seemed to be filling him at an impressive speed, Tony carefully grabbed the stag and slammed the cupboard door shut behind him, taking a deep breath to calm himself down. Tony strode back to Harry and held the stag out to him. Here you go, Harry. Instantly, Harry grabbed the plushie and hugged it close to him with a smile that melted both Pepper and Tony's hearts. A moment later, Vernon returned with the paperwork and all but threw it at Pepper, who checked it quickly before nodding at Tony and putting it back in her bag. Pepper, please take my son to the car, Tony said in a strange voice. I'll be along directly. Tony, Pepper said, a warning in her voice. Perhaps it would be better if you came with us. Tony seemed to struggle with the idea for a moment before nodding in agreement. Turning back to Vernon, Tony took a step forward and said in a dangerous whisper that only Vernon could hear. You kept my son locked in a cupboard for 7 years. You fat pig. Make no mistake, I will make you pay for that. Enjoy your life while you still have it, because I'm going to take everything from you. Spinning on his heel, Tony took Harry's hand and stormed out of the house, leaving a pale and frightened-looking Vernon behind him. Pepper followed the pair, stopping at the front door and turning to Vernon before spitting at him and slamming the door behind her as she left. A moment later, Harry was squashed between Tony and Pepper, who were both smiling down at him warmly. "So, where are we going now?" Harry asked, happier than he had ever been in his life. "Home," Tony replied as he wrapped an arm around his son. "Tomorrow, we'll get you some new clothes and some toys too." "You don't have to waste money on me, sir," Harry mumbled. "I'm not worth it." Pepper and Tony shared a shocked look for a moment before Tony placed his hand under Harry's chin and forced him to look up at Tony. "Harry, you're my son, and I want to take care of you. I don't know what lies your relatives have fed you, but that's all they were, lies. You are completely worth every penny I spend on you, and I don't want you to think otherwise, okay?" Harry bit his lip for a moment before nodding his head that he understood. A few moments later, Harry had nuzzled close to Tony and fallen asleep while Tony watched with a genuine smile. Once Harry was asleep, Tony turned to Pepper, and his expression turned murderous. "I want Vernon Dursley's head." Tony growled, "His wife too. There's no way that she didn't know what was happening to Harry." "I'll get the lawyers started," Pepper replied, her expression just as angry. "I'll inform them to bury the Dursleys in litigation and not stop until they're paupers." "That'll do," Tony nodded. "For now." "Tony, you know that this isn't going to be easy," Pepper warned. "They've done 7 years worth of damage to the kid. He's going to need a lot of help. He's going to need you." "I know that," Tony growled back. "Do you?" Pepper asked. "Because I don't think you do understand what you're getting yourself into. This isn't one of your weekend floozies that you can just ditch when you get bored. Harry is going to need his father, and if you can't be that, then perhaps it would be better if you—" "If I what?" Tony demanded. "Abandon him. No, give him to someone who can actually take care of him," Pepper countered. "He belongs with me, Pepper." Tony hissed. "I won't abandon my son." "I hope that's true," Pepper replied, "for both your sakes." It had begun to rain as they approached the townhouse. And as Tony quickly rushed Harry inside, he whispered a promise. "Daddy's here, Harry, and I'm not going anywhere." Author's note. This story was requested by Stairgirl 4667 and will one day be continued when I have more time. Until then, I will be keeping it here in the vault. Also, as you may have noticed, I had to change the dates to make the story work better with Iron Man. Rocket Wizard. Summary. Harry Potter has spent the last 7 years of his life in abject misery, after being dumped on the doorstep of his relatives. But when the Dursleys finally go too far with punishing Harry, Albus Dumbledore takes it upon himself to remove Harry from their care and take him to his James Potter's second cousin, a man named Raymond Rocket, who lives in Ocean Shores, California. Harry Potter Rocket Power crossover. Albus Dumbledore glared angrily down at the sleeping 8-year-old that lay before him. This was the third time in less than a year that the elderly wizard had been informed that little Harry Potter had been admitted to the hospital due to an accident at home due to his own carelessness, as his relative put it. This time, the poor boy's left arm had been broken and it had immediately set off red flags with the Muggles' Child Services. They had already begun their investigation, but Dumbledore doubted that anything would come of it. Muggles may be good-intentioned at times, but could be just as much incompetent. This cannot be permitted to continue, Dumbledore thought sadly as he stared sadly down at Harry, and stroked his beard thoughtfully. They'll end up killing him at this rate. Ordinarily, Dumbledore would be dressed in bright-colored robes, with his waist-long beard often tucked into his belt. However, due to being forced to visit a Muggle hospital again, he had been forced to don a boring gray suit, and using magic to make his long beard appear short and well-trimmed. Dumbledore had known when he left Harry with the Dursleys 7 years prior, that the family would be unkind to the boy. Petunia's bitterness and jealousy that Lily was a witch, and Petunia was not, was well known to Albus Dumbledore. After all, Lily had made no attempt to hide how her sister felt about her, and about magic in general, but all the same, Dumbledore had hoped that in time Petunia would see young Harry as her own. Now, Dumbledore felt like a fool for ever believing that Petunia could let go of her bitterness. The moon would house the entire Goblin nation first. Dumbledore suddenly felt all of his 150 years as he gazed down at the small boy he had been entrusted with by 2 of his most beloved students. He had truly failed Lily and James for allowing their child to be continuously hurt in this manner. And he prayed that he could one day earn their forgiveness. "No more," Dumbledore whispered softly, anger laced in every word. With all the fury of man with a century of wisdom, Dumbledore spun on his heel and stormed out of the hospital. He would find someone else to care for Harry Potter, no matter how long it took. He owed that and so much more to Lily and James, and especially to little Harry for saving them all from evil. Dumbledore smiled in self-congratulation as he gazed down at the parchment that lay sitting on his desk. It had taken him nearly 3 months of hard work, researching every inch of the Potter family line, but Dumbledore had finally located another member of the direct Potter line, and thereby someone that could take care of Harry. Another magnificent key thing that had occurred in the 3 months since Harry's accident was that sufficient evidence had been discovered at the Dursley residence to convict both Petunia and her disgusting husband of several charges of child abuse, slavery, and willful acts of torture. Each of these convictions carried very heavy sentences, so it was unlikely that either Dursley would breathe free air again for several years. The only pitiable thing had been that the Dursleys' son, Dudley, had fallen into the grasp of Vernon's odious sister. Dumbledore didn't doubt that under her care, the boy would soon resemble his father in both girth and attitude. Harry, on the other hand, had been remanded to the state's care and was currently living in an orphanage. Dumbledore had personally ensured young Harry's continued safety by having Professor McGonagall pose as a worker at the orphanage and keep an eye on him. Turning his attention back to the parchment, Dumbledore frowned. The person in question was a widower named Raymond Rocket, who lived in America with his 2 children. After an exhaustive amount of research into the Potter family tree, Dumbledore had discovered Raymond almost by accident, according to Dumbledore's research. The man was James Potter's second cousin, and had been removed from the main line after Raymond's grandfather had been born a squib. The boy had been quickly adopted into a Muggle family which had moved to America soon after and changed their names to Rocket, to make a new start. The problem wasn't just that Dumbledore would be sending Harry to an entirely new continent, but also whether or not this Raymond Rocket would even want to take care of another child when he already had 2 of his own. There was simply nothing for it. Dumbledore would have to travel to America and have a chat with the man and pray that he would be obliging in Dumbledore's request to take the boy in until it was time for Harry to attend Hogwarts. Raymundo Rocket was having a great day. The sun was shining. His kids were out enjoying the waves, and best of all, the shore shack was filled to the brim with hungry customers. Raymundo had just handed off a customer's order when the oldest-looking person Raymundo had ever seen walked up to the counter with a smile. The elderly man was tall and wearing a dark blue suit and matching bowler cap, with a briefcase clutched in his left hand. Blue eyes stared at Raymundo from behind a pair of glasses. The man's visage made his age impossible to guess, which was compounded by a neatly trimmed beard that hung a few inches below the man's chin. "Good afternoon, my dear fellow," the man said jovially. "Are you Raymond Rocket?" "Raymundo," the man in question said with a wince. "How can I help you?" "My name is Albus Dumbledore, and I was wondering if I might have a moment of your time to discuss something rather important." Sure thing," Raymundo said with a raised brow before turning to his coworker and best friend. "Hey Tito. Will you be okay by yourself for a few minutes?" "Sure thing, brudda," the portly Hawaiian said with a smile as he flipped a burger on the grill. Nodding at his friend, Raymundo quickly made his way around the counter and nodded his head at Dumbledore to follow. Coming to the back of the building, Raymundo leaned up against the railing and crossed his arms over his chest. "So, how can I help you, Mr. Dumbledore?" Casting a quick glance at their surroundings, Dumbledore took in the object of his quest. Raymundo was tall, with cool blue eyes and a golden tan physique that showed how much he enjoyed being outside. As Dumbledore took in Raymundo's appearance, he saw how relaxed the man looked. Raymundo was wearing a simple white t-shirt, blue shorts, and matching flip-flops, while a dark green cap rested on his head, under which blonde yellow hair was poking out. "Mr. Rocket, as I said before, my name is Albus Dumbledore, and I come from England with an important matter that I need to discuss with you." "England, huh?" Raymundo said in surprise. "Never been, but I hear it's a pretty cool place." "So, What brings you all the way to ocean shores, Mr. Dumbledore? I represent the estate of your late second cousin, James Potter, and his wife Lily, Dumbledore said in a sad voice. I have a cousin in England, Raimundo said in surprise before realizing what Dumbledore had just said. You said, late. Unfortunately, Dumbledore nodded sadly. They passed on 7 years ago this Halloween. 7 years ago? Raimundo asked in confusion. So, why are you reaching out to me, now? Because they left behind a son who was soon placed in a truly unsuitable home, and needs a new guardian, Dumbledore replied firmly, making Raimundo's eyes harden at the implication of the old man's words. I take it his old guardians were not the best choice? Raimundo asked in a tight voice. They were not, Dumbledore said softly, looking down past Raimundo to the nearby beach. They were, in fact, quite cruel to the boy. And after their latest form of punishment, in which they broke the poor boy's arm, he has been removed from their care. They broke the boy's arm? Raimundo asked in horror. I hope you guys are making them pay for it. You need not worry there, Dumbledore replied firmly. They will not breathe free air again for a very long time. Good, Raimundo said simply. So, I guess you're here because there is no one else to take the kid in. That's correct, Mr. Rocket, Dumbledore nodded. You are his last remaining family, and if you should turn him away, young RRY will have to stay at the orphanage where he currently resides. Harry, is that his name? Indeed, Dumbledore said with a smile. I understand you have 2 children of your own, and that you might not have the time for him. He will, of course, need help to undo all the damage that his mother's sister and her husband did to him. I will not force you to take him, Mr. Rocket, but I will humbly implore you to do so, for you are all that he has left. By the end of Dumbledore's speech, Raimundo was thoughtfully scratching his chin. On the one hand, Dumbledore was right, the kid would need a lot of patience to fix all the things his relatives had done. No doubt he would also have to talk it over with his kids, Otto, and Reggie, as well, since he would be bringing another child into their home. But on the other hand, Harry had no one left to look after him, and if Raimundo said no, the kid would no doubt spend a long time in some cold orphanage. I'll take him, Mr. Dumbledore, Raimundo said finally. The kid is family, and rockets look after one another, no matter how distantly related. I am so very glad to hear that, Dumbledore said with a genuine smile. I had hoped that would be the case. Laying his briefcase on the rail, Dumbledore opened it and pulled some paperwork from inside before quickly handing it to Raimundo. I just need your signature on these papers, Staten. G. That you adopt Harry Potter into your care and accept all legal responsibility for him. Raimundo quickly read and then signed the paperwork before passing it back to Dumbledore, who happily put it back in his briefcase before pulling out a second batch of paperwork. I also need your signature on these. What are these for? Raimundo asked as he took them and began to read. These are Harry's immigration and naturalization papers, Dumbledore replied. Once you sign and accept responsibility for Harry, he will be a U.S. citizen with all the rights and responsibilities therein. Just like that? Raimundo asked in surprise. That's kinda fast, ain't it? You'd be surprised what feats can be accomplished with the right sort of negotiation, Dumbledore said with a quick wink that made Raimundo smile. Once the paperwork was signed and returned, Dumbledore pulled out a third set of paperwork that made Raimundo groan and Dumbledore smile. Not to worry, Mr. Rocket, Dumbledore said jovially. This doesn't need your signature. It's simply Harry's records, his birth certificate, medical records, etc. Oh, that's cool, then, Raimundo said with relief as he took the paperwork and thumbed through it. Raimundo found himself frowning as he read through the medical records and saw how few times the kid had actually been to a doctor. I shall follow up with you in a few days to discuss the details regarding young Harry. And when you may expect him to arrive from England, Dumbledore said warmly, extending his hand for Raimundo to shake. Once that was done, Dumbledore offered a pleasant goodbye and quickly strode away. Raimundo turned the corner to follow him, only to find to his surprise that the old man had vanished without a trace. Fast for an old man, Raimundo mumbled as he looked around the boardwalk for Dumbledore and found not a trace of him. Shaking his head, Raimundo turned back to see Tito desperately waving at him as he drowned in a sea of customers. Later that night, Raimundo found himself sitting at his dining room table, with his two children sitting in front of him, and looking at him expectantly as he tried to tell his kids that they would soon have a new person living with them. Otto was 10 and took after his mother so much that sometimes it made Raimundo's heart hurt. The boy had fiery red dreadlocks, held back by a green headband, and was wearing a bright yellow t-shirt and red shorts, with white sneakers. Like Raimundo, Otto was heavily tanned and had a relaxed look from behind his green sunglasses as he drummed his fingers on the table impatiently. Next to Otto was Raimundo's oldest child, Reggie, Rocket. Like Otto, Reggie was 12 and had inherited her dad's relaxed demeanor, but where Otto's hair was fiery red, and hung in dreadlocks, Reggie's was dyed purple and hung in ringlets to her shoulders, while her sunglasses rested comfortably on top of her head. Like Otto, Reggie was also dressed comfortably, wearing camouflage pants over red sneakers, and a purple t-shirt with a rocket on it. "So, what's up, Dad?" Reggie asked after a few moments of silence. "Yeah, why do you wanna talk to us?" Otto complained. "We're supposed to meeting Twist and Sam for some night hockey." Deciding to just get it over with, Raimundo took a deep breath and crossed his arms over his chest before he began to speak. "Kids, we need to talk about something important." Seeing his changed demeanor, Otto and Reggie shared a concerned look before turning back to Raimundo. "Earlier today, a man came by the shore shack and asked to speak to me about my cousin in England." Raimundo began, only to be cut off a moment later by Otto's excited cry. "Yo, we have cousins in England. That's so cool, Otto," Reggie growled, making the kid look at his sister. "Stop interrupting." "Sorry, Dad," Otto mumbled as Raimundo smiled at Reggie gratefully. "As I was saying," Raimundo continued, "according to the man I met with, my second cousin, James Potter, and his wife died 7 years ago, leaving behind their son, Harry." 7 years? Otto asked in confusion. "So, why are we just learning about him now?" "Yeah, it does seem kinda weird, Eggy added with a nod at her little brother. "The reason why we haven't heard about him before now," Raimundo said with a sigh, "is because Harry was placed with his mother's sister due to her having a closer claim to the boy." "Did something happen to Harry's aunt?" Reggie asked, still confused as to why her dad wanted to talk to them. "Something," Raimundo said with a growl that made Otto and Reggie share another look. Taking another deep breath, Raimundo continued speaking in a controlled voice. "Harry's aunt and uncle were not qualified to be around children, and as such I was asked if I would be willing to take the kid in. Since I'm all he has left." "Not qualified? What's that supposed to mean?" Otto asked in confusion, tilting his head to emphasize that he didn't understand. Reggie on the other hand paled as she took in her dad's words, and tears formed in the corner of her eyes. "Hello," Reggie cried out at her brother in annoyance. "Wake up, Rocket Boy. He means that they were abusing the kid." Otto's eyes widened in horror, and he quickly turned to Raimundo, hoping that his dad would deny Reggie's claim, only for Raimundo to sadly nod at his son, who quickly paled in horror. "Harry's aunt and uncle have apparently been very cruel to the boy since they first took him in, and recently broke the poor boy's arm, which resulted in the authorities finally taking the kid away from his relatives," Raimundo said sadly, causing both his kids to pale and allowing Raimundo to continue, uninterrupted. "He has no other family but us, so I agreed to take the poor boy in. She wanted to let you both know what he's been through so you won't be so rough with him." "How can anyone do that to a kid?" Reggie asked in horror. "How old is he?" "He's 8, Raimundo said softly, "and some people are just cruel. There's no rhyme or reason to it, they just are." "So, the kid's coming here?" Otto asked. "From England. That's so sweet." "Hello," Reggie called again. "Were you listening to Dad when he said the kid has spent the last 7 years being abused? The kid is going to be a wreck." Turning to her dad, Reggie asked in a small voice, "Are you sure about this, Dad?" Raimundo was silent for a moment while he took in his daughter's words. Reggie was right, Harry would need a lot of work in the coming years, but the boy was a rocket, and rockets looked after their own. "It's not going to be easy," Raimundo said at last, "but from what that old guy told me, Harry has never had a real home, and we're all he has left of family. He needs us, and no matter how distantly related, Harry is a rocket." And rockets do not turn away from family in need. Totally. Otto cried, raising a fist in the air. I always wanted a little brother. I already have one, Reggie said as she rolled her eyes. But I could stand another one, I guess. You guys are the best, Raimundo said warmly, getting up and walking over to his kids before taking them in his arms in a hug. And I know you'll look after Harry like family. As long as he's not like the squid, Otto muttered, making Raimundo and Reggie turn to him in annoyance. Otto. They both cried out in unison. Har. Ry Potter tried not to show how afraid he was as he sat in the middle next to Mrs. McGonagall and Mr. Dumbledore. The plane was finally descending and soon Harry would meet the new people chosen to look after him since he was taken from the Dursleys nearly 4 months prior. Mrs. McGonagall was one of the workers at the orphanage where Harry had been placed after the Dursleys broke his arm, and, while strict, she was also the first one to be nice to Harry and had made sure to spend time with the boy nearly every day. Most days, the two would just talk, and Harry was surprised at how quickly he had found himself opening up to her. That was probably why the orphanage had chosen her to act as chaperone for Harry until his new guardians took responsibility for him. As per usual, she had chosen to wear a forest green dress for this outing, and had her auburn hair tied in a tight bun behind her head. Mr. Dumbledore, on the other hand, was apparently the executor of the Potter estate, whatever that meant, and as such had been the one to successfully locate Harry's last remaining family member. He was dressed in a pale blue suit and had his bowler hat resting on his lap as he enjoyed the delightful feeling of landing. Due to the fact that the only clothes that Harry owned had once belonged to his cousin, Dudley, Mr. Dumbledore had taken Harry clothes shopping the day before, which as why Harry was wearing a forest green dress shirt, khakis, and a white pair of sneakers. Mr. Dumbledore had even taken Harry to get a brand new pair of glasses, which had greatly improved Harry's vision. Worry not, young Harry, Dumbledore said jovially as the plane landed and the passengers began to rise to their feet. I'm sure you and your new family will get along wonderfully. Far better than your old guardians, at any rate. Mrs. McGonagall sniffed. I refuse to call them your family. Now Minerva, Dumbledore said soothingly, only to clam up when she shot him a venomous look. I think that's Dumbledore, Raimundo said from where he was sitting. Next to him, Tito was enjoying a soda and suddenly looked at where Raimundo was pointing. Descending the escalator were 2 adults and a small boy, as Tito took in the kid. His eyebrows raised in concern. He looks small for an 8-year-old, Brutta, Tito said softly as he and Raimundo rose to their feet and walked to the escalator. I know, Raimundo replied. He looks so much younger. Raimundo had chosen to leave the kids at home while he went to pick up Harry, and he was secretly glad at that, now that he saw what Harry looked like. It was going to take a lot of work to repair all the damage that the kids' relatives had done to him. Greetings, Mr. Rocket, Dumbledore said jovially as the two groups met, and to you as well, sir. Name's Tito, the portly Hawaiian replied happily, and a good day to you, Brutta. Hello, sir, Harry replied in a shy voice, still not entirely used to speaking out of turn. My name is Harry. Thank you for taking me in. Kneeling down in front of the boy, Raimundo placed a calm hand on Harry's shoulder and smiled gently down at him. Hello Harry, my name is Raimundo, and this is my best friend, Tito. What's up, little cuz? Tito said with a wink that made Harry smile a bit. You don't need to thank me for taking you in, Harry, Raimundo continued. That's what family does, they look after one another. They do, Harry asked in confusion. Then why didn't the Dursleys like me? Did I do something wrong? No, little cuz, Tito said at once. You didn't do anything wrong, they did. Family shouldn't treat one another like your aunt treated you, Raimundo said gently, and in time, I promise I'll show you just how family should treat one another. Okay, sir, Ari said as he worried his lip and looked at his feet, still not completely understanding. Raimundo saw this and looked sideways at Tito, both nodding in understanding that this was going to take some time. I cannot express enough my gratitude, Mr. Rocket, Dumbledore said warmly, for your agreement in taking in Mr. Potter. As I told Harry, Raimundo replied as he rose to his feet, he's family and rockets look after family. All the same, you have my gratitude, sir, Dumbledore said with a nod, and now that my mission is finished, I'm afraid Mrs. McGonagall and I must be on our way back home. So soon? Harry said quickly and making Dumbledore turn and smile down at him. I'm afraid so, Harry. But I will return when you turn 11 to discuss your inheritance. Nodding in understanding, Harry waved sadly at Mrs. McGonagall, who promptly stepped forward, kneeled down, and gave Harry a quick hug. Raimundo and Tito both narrowed their eyes when they saw Harry flinch at the woman's hug. And then froze as though he didn't know what to do. Brutta, Tito muttered. I know, Tito, Raimundo replied. After releasing Harry from her embrace, Mrs. McGonagall rose back to her feet, fared a quick nod at Raimundo and Tito and then spun on her heel and stepped away as Dumbledore stepped forward and offered an outstretched hand, which Raimundo swiftly took. Until next time, then, Dumbledore said jovially. Goodbye, Mr. Dumbledore, Raimundo replied with a nod, until our next meeting. Without another word, Dumbledore and McGonagall spun on their heel and quickly disappeared amongst the rest of the crowd at the airport, leaving Harry alone with Tito and Raimundo. Ready to go, little cuz? Tito asked with a smile as he extended his hand to the boy. Harry stared at the ND for a moment with uncertainty before slowly extending his own hand and taking Tito's. There we go, little cuz, Tito said warmly. Let's get back to the shack and I'll make you a nice Ocean Shores cheeseburger. I've never had a cheeseburger before, Harry replied with wide eyes, making Raimundo and Tito both stare at the boy in surprise. What? They cried in unison. That's an outrage, Raimundo said in mock anger. Agreed, Brutta, Tito cried. To the shack, so we can fix this. Before Harry could say anything, he found himself being pulled toward the exit by a smiling Tito, while Raimundo talked about how he would make Harry's first cheeseburger the best he'll ever have. Despite his anxiety, Harry couldn't help but smile. Dumbledore and McGonagall watched unseen as Harry departed with his new guardian. Each sporting a different expression. Dumbledore watched with a hopeful expression, while McGonagall watched with anxiety. Are you sure this is wise, Albus? The Rockets are the only ones left that Harry can call family. And from our one interaction alone, I can already tell that they will be a far better choice than the Dursleys. I hope you're right, Albus, McGonagall said with a frown. You've already let me down once regarding Harry. I know, Albus said sadly, your anger is nothing compared with my guilt. What about his magic? McGonagall asked. Will his new guardians not have questions when his accidental magic makes itself known? You need not worry about that, Dumbledore replied with a smile. I put a bind on his magic which will remove itself upon Harry's 11th birthday. So, until then he will be an ordinary boy. Good, McGonagall said simply before pulling out an old tin can. Then, can we please go home? I've had quite enough of living amongst the Muggles. Yes, I quite agree, Dumbledore said as he placed a finger on the can in McGonagall's hand. Let's go home. The moment the words were out of Dumbledore's mouth, tin can glowed blue and causing both adults to disappear an instant later without a trace. Author's note. I was asked to make this story by Terran96, and liked the idea. Hopefully I can return and finish it one day. Until then, I'll leave it here. For whom the bell tolls. For whom the bell tolls. Summary. Loki's plans have once again been foiled by the Avengers and S.H.I.E.L.D. and he's had enough of their interruption. Thank you very much. In a last-ditch effort to defeat his hated brother, Thor, and his allies, Loki decides to summon the one being that he truly believes has the power to finally end the Avengers, Death. But as Loki and the Avengers soon discover, Death does not enjoy being summoned, and there is a price to pay for gaining his attention. Harry Potter Marvel crossover. Death, once known as Harry Potter, sat alone in his chambers contemplating. The room he sat in was pitch black, like his throne, so that it appeared that he was squatting on thin air. Still, the most noticeable thing was the quiet. It was claustrophobic and completely silent, making the chamber far more intimidating than intended. Still, it was made for only one occupant, and its chosen enjoyed the stillness. It had been eons since his defeat of Voldemort, and Harry's prison sentence began. At least, it felt like eons to Harry. Time had no place in his prison, and it was here that Harry had chosen To remain once it became apparent what had been done to him, of how the previous incarnation of death had tricked him into becoming what he was. Harry had done what no one else had done in millennia. He had reunited the three Deathly Hallows and become the master of death. Unfortunately, what no one had known, not even Harry's research-obsessed best friend, Hermione Granger, was that whoever unit them didn't become the master of death, but instead became the new personification of it. Forced to bear the title, ferry souls to where they belong, and guard the gates of the dead to ensure that souls remained across the river where they belonged, until someone else united the three Deathly Hallows and set the previous incarnation free. When the previous incarnation had told Harry of what his life would be like from now on, laughing as it did so, at its freedom, Harry had been horrified and enraged that despite all the pain and struggle he had faced, he was still being forced to endure still more. The previous death had told Harry that he would live forever as the new death until someone took possession of the Deathly Hallows. Anew, only then would Harry be free and wed to cross the river and join his loved ones. The salt in the wound came when the previous death told Harry that he couldn't trick the Hallows either by just randomly giving them to someone. The Hallows seemed to have an intelligence of their own and would recognize such deception. Harry had raged at the injustice of it all and demanded that death take its Hallows back, but that had just made death laugh. Much to Harry's confusion, "The Hallows are not mine, stupid boy," death had hissed, "nor did they belong to the death before me. I simply gifted them to the three foolish brothers who thought themselves more powerful than me, just as you will one day gift them to the world, hoping that one day someone unites them and sets you free." "Then who do they belong to?" "No one knows," death replied. "Only that they are a trap, not a gift. And the only way to free yourself is by trapping another." "I will never do that," Harry snarled, frowning as death chuckled. "I said that once, too." Harry could hear the despair in death's voice, even as its features were hidden beneath its cloak, and even through the fog of rage, he could tell how sorry it was to be doing this to Harry. A golden light then quickly consumed death, and it issued a sigh of contentment that made Harry's heart weep before disappearing entirely and leaving Harry, once again, alone in his room. Harry had tried to ignore his new duties for a few decades, choosing instead to enjoy the life he had won from Voldemort. Harry married Ginny Weasley, started a family, and finally got to enjoy the life he always wanted. Making himself appear to age so that no one got suspicious had taken some work, but being the new death had come with some fantastic perks. Like having his magical core quadruple in size and making Merlin look like a first-year student compared to Harry's power now. After 90 years of this, Harry knew he could no longer stay. Most of his friends had since died, and his children were grown and had long since left to start their own families. When Ginny had died at the ripe old age of 156, Harry had known that his time in this world had officially come to an end. Hermione was the only one of his friends left alive by that point, and Harry couldn't take leaving without saying goodbye to his oldest friend. Paying one last visit to her, Harry had to bite back his heartache at seeing the old woman lying there, barely clinging on. Hermione had had a brilliant career in her long life. Following the fall of Voldemort, Hermione, with the aid of Harry and Ron, had launched a campaign of change upon magical Britain that had dragged the magical world into the 21st century. Kicking and screaming, wanting to make amends for past wrongs, Hermione had worked tirelessly to ensure goblins finally earned equal rights, which had granted the trio and all their descendants the title of Goblin Friend in perpetuity. Magical creatures had also received far more rights under Hermione's tenure. It was no surprise to anyone when she was voted Minister of Magic soon after she turned 24, the youngest minister in the ministry's history. She and Ron had married a few years later and had 6 beautiful children, each as intelligent as their mother and each a lover of pranks, like their father. Ron, after the war, had decided to pursue his dream of playing keeper for the Chudley Cannons, and to the surprise of all, actually managed to make it to the Quidditch World Cup in Ron's 5th year of playing with them. They lost spectacularly Germany, but Harry and all of Ron's classmates had been there, shouting their throats out in support, all the same. After a successful Quidditch career, Ron had followed Harry into the Auror department. Together, the two of them became the scythe of the ministry, cutting down any would-be Dark Lord foolish enough to attempt to cause trouble in England. There had been dozens of assassination attempts on the trio since their victory over the Death Eaters. Still, magical Britain came down like a hammer on the ones responsible, determined to never allow the rise of a Dark Lord like Voldemort again. And that promise had been kept for over a century, for almost 125 years. There hadn't been a Dark Lord in Britain, thanks mainly to the tireless work of the trio, whom the world had decided to immortalize with the title, the Heroes of Magic, upon Harry's 50th birthday, along with a giant statue that would forever sit in the entrance hall of the ministry. Ron had laughed himself silly at the name, and even Hermione would blush in a BJECT humiliation if anyone called her by the title. As Harry sat alone in the darkness, his mind traveled unwillingly to that last encounter with his friend. Flashback. As Harry gazed down at the form lying in front of him, he couldn't help but take a shuddering breath as he desperately fought against the wave of despair that tore through him. Ron had passed a decade ago in his sleep, and Hermione, it seemed, was soon to follow if the healer was to be believed. Harry felt tears run down his face as he remembered the day Ron died. It was the first time that Harry had used his new powers as D.Eth, and had summoned Ron's soul so that he could say goodbye to his first friend. Now, only Hermione was left, and Harry would be all alone. The last of the greatest generation, is what the papers were beginning to call him. And he hated that title more than he had ever hated his previous ones. She's gotten so old, Harry thought sadly as he looked down at his oldest friend. Her curly brown hair had turned as white as snow, and age had ripped her once beautiful features away, leaving a tired old woman in her place. Harry, Hermione whispered, bringing Harry's attention back to the present. Yeah, Hermione, Harry said softly, placing a warm hand atop hers as he sat beside her. It's me. I can hear him, Hermione whispered with a smile. He's calling me home. Who, Hermione? Ry asked with a sad smile as a tear ran down his face. Ron, of course, Hermione smiled. Of course, Harry nodded. You can't expect your husband to let you cross the river alone, can you? He also told me what you are, Hermione said softly, making Harry freeze on the spot. Taking another shuddered breath, Harry replied. He did. Yes, Hermione said sadly, and I'm so sorry that I have to leave you here all alone, Harry. I wish I could stay with you. See the things you will. I wish that too. Harry choked. Please don't leave me, Hermione. I'm Death. I can save you if you ask me to. Ari had offered the same thing to Ron and had all but begged his first friend to agree, but as Harry saw Hermione sadly shake her head and smile up at him, Harry knew she was about to say the same thing as Ron. Death is a natural part of life, Harry. Hermione sighed again, showing her amazing sagacity, and you are Death. To subvert your own rules would bring unknowable chaos to existence as we know it. I don't want this, Harry sobbed, burying his face into the blanket atop Hermione. I never wanted this. All I've ever wanted is to be normal. When have we ever gotten anything we want in this life? Hermione laughed, as she ran a soft hand over Harry's head. You were born to do great things, Harry, I've always known that. And now you will have millennia to do them. I love you, Hermione Weasley, Harry said softly, raising his head to look into her soft brown eyes one last time, knowing that it was almost time. His powers as Death told him that soon Hermione's soul would pass through him and cross to the land of the dead. And I love you, Harry Potter, Hermione whispered weakly. Harry, will you promise me something? Anything, Harry said at once. Promise me that throughout the millennia, no matter how hard it gets, don't stop caring about people. I promise, Hermione, Harry replied after only a moment's hesitation, causing the old woman to smile at him one last time before her eyes grew wide. And she whispered, Ron. Turning to see what she was looking at, Harry saw his first friend standing in the doorway, looking like he did when he was 17. Hey, am I? Ron said with a cheeky grin. Ready to go home. Everyone's waiting for us. A second later, Hermione drew her last breath and slowly closed her eyes with a smile firmly on her face, as Harry watched. Her soul, glowing like a miniature sun, slowly exited her body and landed next to Ron. A moment later, The soul began to shift and change as Harry watched wide-eyed until it finally took on Hermione's form as she was 17. Taking Ron's hand, Hermione smiled, and Harry felt tears run down his face as he watched them turn to leave. "Please," Harry whispered, "please don't leave. Don't go where I can't follow." Turning back to look at Harry, he could see that both looked heartbroken, as though they didn't want to leave yet had no choice, and Harry felt himself openly sobbing. "It's not forever, mate," Ron said softly, "and when your job is done, we'll be waiting to hear all about it. First round's on me." In that moment, all Harry wanted to do was grab onto them and make them stay with him. But he knew if he did that, it would not be right, and his friends would suffer for his selfishness, so instead, Harry took a deep shuddering breath and tried to fight through the pain in his heart. "Count on it," Harry laughed, sobbed, watching with tears in his eyes as his friends waved one last time and stepped out of the door, disappearing the moment they passed the threshold. And leaving Harry alone with the body of Hermione Weasley. Slowly rising to his feet, Harry kissed Hermione's forehead one final time before turning and making his way out of the room. Once in the hallway, Harry let his illusion slip away, leaving a 17-year-old standing where once was an old man. Healers rushed past him and into Hermione's room, all without noticing the teenager watching sadly, having already made up his mind. Tomorrow night, Harry's eldest son would be coming with his family, and he would find Harry's body, having apparently died in his sleep. The illusion Harry would cast would ensure that the body would remain until put into the ground, after that it would vanish, leaving an empty coffin. Harry Potter would die, and the new Death would begin his job. How long had it been since that day? Death no longer knew. For a time, Death had traveled the multiverse, intent on ensuring that all the other Harry Potters throughout time and space had the life that Death never did. Death slaughtered millions of Voldemort saved his parents countless times, and yet as time continued to stretch, Death found his humanity leaving bit by bit as he watched entire solar systems explode into being, live out their lives, and then eventually die, all while he remained unchanged. Terrified of becoming the monster that Voldemort had become, he had finally decided to exile himself here. To this place where time and space meant nothing, all the while hating himself for breaking his promise to Hermione. As Death sat alone in his chamber, he felt his being physically being pulled at. And he felt his eyes widen in disbelief. Someone was trying to summon him. More than that, though, whoever was trying to summon him, he was actually using a spell to try and control him, the arrogance. Slowly rising to his feet, Death latched onto the pole, determined to show its originator what happens when you try to control a being as powerful as Death. Loki glared hatefully at his brother, not far away. His brother's allies, the so-called Avengers, were standing in ready formation to attack, and Loki felt his lip curl in a petulant sneer. "All right, reindeer games," Iron Man sighed arrogantly as he raised his arm and powered up his blaster. "We can do this easy or hard, whichever you prefer. But to be honest, I'm hoping you'll say hard. You just have one of those punchable faces." "He really does, doesn't he?" Hawkeye added with a smirk. "Filthy mortals," Loki snarled, rising shakily to his feet, his body still sore from his brother's last attack, ripping his horned helmet from his head. Loki angrily hurled it aside before turning back to the watching heroes. "I am a god. You are dust beneath my fingernails, and yet you have the audacity to stand in my way." "Gods though we may be, brother," Thor replied, "that doesn't give us the right to do that type of things you have done. And today, I will see justice upon you." "No, brother," Loki snarled as he drew a large dagger from his belt and plunged it into his right hand, causing the Avengers to stare in horror. "Today is the day my rule begins." "What have you done, brother?" Thor demanded, hefting his hammer and preparing to throw it. "I summon the first," Loki snarled in reply, causing Thor's eyes to widen in horror. An instant later, a violent wind sprang out of nowhere, knocking the Avengers from their feet. The Lord of the First Promise, the last enemy to be defeated. "Brother, stop," Thor shouted as the winds picked up. "You must not do this." "What the hell is going on?" Hawkeye shouted from the nearby beam he was desperately clinging to. "We must stop my brother before he completes the summoning," Thor shouted. "What is he summoning?" Captain America demanded as he used his shield as a buffer against the wind. though even he was having trouble staying on his feet. Before Thor could answer, Loki shouted one last time, his voice filling the entire room. I summon you here, and demand your obedience. A strange amalgamation of a triangle inside a circle, with a line down the center of it, 50 feet high and made of blinding white light, suddenly exploded into existence between the Avengers and Loki. We're too late, Thor whispered in horror as the wind suddenly stopped, and the room descended into an unnatural silence. Quickly turning to his friends, Thor dropped to one knee and said, "Kneel, you fools. Our only hope is to make him understand that we're not the ones who summoned him." "Sorry, Point Break, but I'm not into the whole kneeling thing," Iron Man replied sarcastically. Only to groan in pain when Thor grabbed him by the back of his head and forced him to the floor. "Stark, I know that belligerence and sarcasm are as air to you, but this one time, you will be silent, or we will all die. Is that clear?" Tony could do nothing but groan, but Thor took that to mean understood, and released his hold on the man's skull, seeing how serious Thor was being. The oath. Avengers slowly lowered themselves to the floor while Loki began to laugh madly. "You've lost, brother. It took me almost 2,000 years to find this summoning spell, but now that I have, nothing will ever be able to stand in my way. For I am the master of death." An instant later, a cloaked figure stepped forward, and a feeling of utter dread seemed to fill the room. Even Black Widow, who had faced horrors beyond imaging, suddenly felt terrified and knew that if she so much as moved without permission, she would die screaming. As the cloaked figure took a slow look around, the Avengers suddenly felt like small animals caught in the gaze of a predator, and each said a silent prayer. "It worked." Loki cackled. "I can't believe it actually worked. I am the master of death. You have the Hallows," the figure asked, and each Avenger could hear the desperation in the figure's voice, causing Tony and Steve to share a look. "What?" Loki demanded. "I don't know what those are, but I summoned you, and so I am your master. And my first command is to kill those filthy mortals." Turning back to the kneeling Avengers, the figure stared at them thoughtfully before its arm shot out. Loki suddenly found himself suspended off the ground with the figure's hand around his throat. Slowly turning back to face the god, Loki felt his blood freeze in his veins as he looked into the face of a man with coal-black hair and burning green eyes, and such eyes they were. It was like looking into the face of eternity, and for a moment, Loki knew just how foolish he had been to try and put a leash on a being such as this. "You dare to command me without uniting the Hallows?" Death roared, causing everyone to flinch as 1,000 voices seemed to speak as one. "You dare presume to command me? Allow me to show you the error of your ways, foolish god." Before anyone could react, Death raised its hand and touched Loki on the brow with his index finger, causing Loki to instantly begin shrieking in pain as the Avengers watched in horror. With a final sneer, Death threw Loki's body to the ground where it continued to convulse as he screamed in agony. Turning to the still kneeling Avengers, Ath stared thoughtfully for a moment as he considered what to do. It had been eons since he had last physically visited a world, and honestly, he was beginning to go mad living all alone in the dark. He wanted to talk to someone, to feel the wind on his face again. Gods, how long had it been since he had a cup of tea? "And you?" Death asked. A dozen voices mixed as one. "Were you also a part of this?" "I swear to thee, I took no part in my brother's lunacy," Thor replied firmly, and Death nodded in satisfaction when he heard no tremor in the man's voice. "And you don't mind that even as we speak, your brother is trapped in an illusion where he is being tortured repeatedly over the course of 1,000 years?" Death asked in an amused voice, making the Avengers shudder in horror at what Loki was experiencing. "My brother made his choice," Thor replied sadly but firmly, "and now he must deal with the consequences of that choice." Good answer," Death drawled. "Just for that, I won't kill any of you." "Thank you, my lord," Thor replied in noticeable relief. A moment later, the oppressive aura dissipated, and the Avengers slowly climbed to their feet. As they watched with suspicious eyes, Death began to stretch and twist, groaning in pleasure as his joints popped and cracked. Realizing that he was being watched, Death turned back to his audience and seemed to grow shy under their eyes, which shocked them. "Sorry," Death said after a moment, "you won't believe how stiff you become after sitting on an ebony chair for a few millennia. Now, how about a change of clothes?" The Avengers watched in shock as Death suddenly snapped his fingers, and its black cloak fell away into nothing, leaving a young man wearing blue jeans and a black shirt. He was tall, with messy black hair that hung to his shoulders. But the thing that drew the most attention was his eyes. They were large, dark green, and filled with so much power that it seemed to physically hurt the Avengers to look into them for too long. He had a bored expression on his face as he finished stretching. "All right, enough already," Death said with a frown as he snapped his fingers, causing Loki to finally go silent as he passed out from the pain. Walking over to the unconscious form, Death grabbed Loki by the hair and threw him into his brother's arms. "Next time, he's mine," Death said coldly. "Are we clear?" "We are, my lord," Thor replied with a nod. "Good," Death said with a smile, "then our business is concluded, so if you'll excuse me." Turning to leave, Death stopped when Captain America called out to him. "Wait, what are you going to do now?" "I hadn't given it much thought," Death replied with a smile, "but I think I'll go on a walkabout, ta." Spinning on his heel, Death disappeared with a pop, leaving the Avengers staring at the spot he had just stood in shock. "So, who wants to tell Fury that the literal Grim Reaper is now walking around Earth?" Iron Man asked sarcastically, causing the Avengers to look at one another in horror before crying out in unison.